Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Thursday, March 20th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Jon Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 531 of the genocide in Gaza. Coming up, we'll be joined by human rights lawyer Craig Mokhiber to talk about Israel's decision to shift back from slow genocide by starvation to mass murder by bombing. And as the Trump administration intensifies its crackdown on dissent, we will talk to journalist and researcher Eli Clifton about the role of pro-Israel megadonor Miriam Adelson in the arrest of Columbia University student leader Mahmoud Khalil. Later on in the program, Jon will cover Israel's wave of assassinations in Gaza and the Yemeni armed forces battle in the Red Sea. But first, here's a brief summary of some of the latest developments this week in Palestine. After 58 days of a so-called ceasefire in Gaza, during which Israel violated its agreed-upon terms hundreds of times, including killing more than 150 Palestinians, refusing to allow in critical food, fuel, water, infrastructure, housing materials, heavy machinery, and medications, and then sealing the crossings for more than 2 weeks, Israel's military resumed widespread and relentless attacks on Palestinians in Gaza, beginning in the early hours of Tuesday morning. In the first few hours of the bombings, artillery fire and drone strikes on residential areas and sites sheltering displaced families, Israel killed more than 400 Palestinians, half of them children, in what Defense for Children International Palestine called, quote, one of the largest one-day child death tolls in Gaza in history. Abubaker, a program director with the children's rights group, added that, quote, Israeli forces have signed a death warrant for Palestinian children in Gaza as they carry out non-stop attacks, continue to destroy civilian infrastructure, and prevent any humanitarian aid from reaching Palestinians in need. This is nothing short of a genocide. Our senior editor, Maureen Claire Murphy, wrote in her report, Israel resumes genocidal attacks on Gaza, killing 400, that, quote, Israel also ordered the evacuation of areas of eastern Gaza near Jabalia in the north and Khan Yunis in the south. The strikes appear to signal Israel's withdrawal from the negotiations process to permanently end the war in Gaza. The ceasefire was supposed to allow for a surge in humanitarian aid, Maureen adds, but Israel ordered the closure of Gaza's crossings more than 2 weeks ago, creating a new food crisis in the territory where people have endured deprivation of life essentials such as electricity, fuel, adequate food, and clean water since October 2023. Because of the intensified siege, medical workers have been reporting that floods of injured men, women, and children were brought to hospitals and clinics, but there are still few basic medications or supplies to treat them. Dr. Mohammed Mustafa, an Australian physician working in Gaza, posted this video to his Instagram account just hours after the bombings began early Tuesday morning.
The smell of burnt flesh is still in my nose.
Oh, we're going to try and play that video as soon as we can. The Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza reported that along with 404 Palestinians killed on Tuesday alone, more than 560 people were injured, and a number of victims were still under the rubble. The Palestinian Civil Defense, which has few recovery tools available to them as Israel has bombed their emergency vehicle fleet over the last 18 months, worked hard to pull people out of the rubble. Let's see if we can go back to that video by Dr. Mohammed Mustafa. Okay, maybe we don't have that video available. Okay, we'll come back to it. On Wednesday, the Health Ministry's Director of Field Hospitals, Marwan Al-Hams, told Al Jazeera that, quote, anyone who sustains a serious injury in the Gaza Strip is doomed to die due to the lack of resources. As we reported last week, Israel had shut off the last remaining electricity access for a key water desalination plant in Deir Balah, creating a deeper scarcity for clean drinking water. �2 said that the water shortage poses, quote, a particular danger to kidney patients. In an interview with Al Jazeera Arabic, Dr. Mohammed Abu Salmiya, the head of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, who was abducted by Israeli forces in November 2023 and detained and tortured in an Israeli prison camp for 7 months, described the situation as catastrophic. He said that on Tuesday morning, quote, there were 50 bodies at the emergency department and another 30 at the morgue refrigerator. Operation rooms were full and many injured people have died in front of our eyes while we couldn't treat them. He added that the health system in northern Gaza has largely collapsed with only one oxygen generator, one CT scanning machine, and one X-ray machine, and there are shortages of medicines and consumables that's such that the exhausted medical teams had to wash and sterilize gauze to use it again. Some casualties were brought to the hospital by animal carts, and the hospital received several cases of amputees as well as beheaded bodies and those that had been torn apart, Dr. Abu Salmiya added. The United Nations stated that the Israeli military issued forcible evacuation orders for areas in North Gaza and eastern Khan Yunis. In total, 19 neighborhoods were directly affected, including 13 in North Gaza and 6 in eastern Khan Yunis, affecting an estimated 30,000 and 35,000 people, respectively, the UN said. Israeli bombing attacks continued across Gaza on Wednesday and into today, killing more than 100 Palestinians in a 24-hour period. In Khan Yunis on Wednesday, an Israeli drone strike killed a 2.5-year-old child, identified as Omar Qasem Talab Abu Sharkiya. A reporter with the Wafa news agency said that the toddler was rushed to a nearby hospital with a head wound, and medics pronounced him dead shortly after he arrived. In Rafah, a paramedic told Al Jazeera that Israel targeted a car transporting civilians from one place to another. He told the network that, quote, we were horrified to see that there were 5 martyrs inside the vehicle, burned and dismembered. This is what Rafah is experiencing around the clock, the medic said. Rafah remains a dangerous place where bombings occur daily in border areas. Additionally, targeting and gunfire continue nonstop. In the northern city of Beit Lahia, an Israeli airstrike killed at least 16 Palestinians, Wafa reported on Wednesday. Their reporter said that Israeli warplanes bombed a group of mourners who had gathered to grieve a family that had been slaughtered and offer condolences to their surviving relatives. Other bombings were reported in Gaza City and in central Gaza on Wednesday. Last night, Al Jazeera's reporter Tarek Abu Azoum said that there was a, quote, brutal escalation of airstrikes in the southern Gaza Strip, particularly in Khan Yunis and Rafah. At least 10 homes were leveled to the ground, and more than 10 Palestinians were killed, including young children. He said, quote, we can see now this is a clear surge in airstrikes at such a very critical time when these houses are very densely populated with civilians. Meanwhile, the Israeli army announced that it had repositioned its tanks and ground troops back into parts of the Netzarim corridor, from which they had withdrawn in February under Phase 1 of the ceasefire. The Guardian reported that according to unnamed Western Aid officials, a private security company that had been manning checkpoints in the Netzarim area withdrew overnight, and Israeli troops in armored vehicles, tanks, and on foot moved in at dawn on Wednesday. Traveling from north to south Gaza is now impossible, the unnamed Western officials said. Just days before Israel resumed the mass-scale genocide, 9 people, 3 of them journalists, were killed in an Israeli drone strike targeting a relief team in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza, on Saturday. The team was on the ground to help set up tent shelters for displaced families, according to the head of the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Foundation, a British charity that sponsored the relief team. They were filming the aid efforts for the charity, and it was a, quote, purely humanitarian mission, the charity's leader said. Meanwhile, the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Palestine concluded that Israel's sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinians is systemic and widespread and amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Commission's report also states that Israel has been responsible for acts of genocide in Gaza since October 2023. The Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor said that, quote, the long-standing impunity enjoyed by Israel, which has enabled it to continue its systematic crimes against Palestinians, must end immediately due to the seriousness of the report's contents. The report found that sexual and gender-based violence, which has risen in frequency and severity, is being perpetrated across the occupied Palestinian territory as a strategy of war for Israel to dominate and destroy the Palestinian people, according to a statement by the UN Human Rights Office. Specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence, such as forced public stripping and nudity, sexual harassment including threats of rape, as well as sexual assault, comprise part of the Israeli Security Forces' standard operating procedures toward Palestinians, the UN says. Other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and violence to the genitals, were committed either under explicit orders or with implicit encouragement by Israel's top civilian and military leadership, the report said. A climate of impunity also exists with regard to sexual and gender-based crimes committed by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, with the aim of instilling fear into the Palestinian community and expelling them. We'll have much more on the UN report in the coming weeks. We've published many features on the Electronic Intifada in the last week, but we wanted to highlight excerpts of The Smell of Death Returns in Gaza by Jana Ahmed Abu Sitta. She wrote this in the aftermath of Tuesday morning's attacks. Quote, I don't know what time it is. I don't remember what day it is. I don't know what's happening. All I know is that I am now awake and the occupation's missiles are shaking the ground. I turn on my phone and look into the glow of the small screen. March 18th, 2025, 2 a.m. 5 minutes before I was in a deep sleep. Hours before my family and I had gathered for a meal at our home in Khan Yunis. Despite the sadness in Gaza, we have tried to make Ramadan nights beautiful. My mother was making tea on the stove and had gathered cookies for the family. Then we went to bed, dispersing around the house, each of us taking a corner to sleep in or to read until we fell asleep. But now I am awake, and I consider that perhaps the entire population of the Gaza Strip is also waking up at this very moment because the explosions are so loud. We are in a terrifying new reality. Minutes pass, and the sounds of bombardment get louder, explosions continue, and I try to decipher how near they are. My little sister is also awake and crying, and I try to calm her down, but my own anxiety is unbearable. I am writing from a building near the Nasser Medical Complex. I am watching the ambulances and cars rush by in desperate attempts to save one soul from death. But I also sense that each ambulance carries one soul that is departing this earth. It has been a month since I smelled death in Gaza, but now it comes back to me with ease. I try to write about hope and strength, but the only voice I can channel now is the one of horror inside me. We are good people with deep feelings. We dream of journeys other than displacement and living in something other than tents. We grieve when we bury our children, and we try to understand how death has become ordinary. How can a few people control the fate of another people? That's an excerpt from Jana Ahmed Abu Sitta's feature, The Smell of Death Returns in Gaza, on electronicintifada.net. Turning now to the occupied West Bank, where Israeli army raids and intensified settler colonial violence have continued in the northern region for 2 months, and where nearly 70 Palestinians have been killed. The Electronic Intifada's associate editor, Tamara Nassar, reported that the Israeli army has uprooted around 85% of the streets of Jenin refugee camp in the north, according to the municipality's director. 1/4 of the refugee camp's population has been forcibly displaced, the city's mayor said in a statement. Nearly 40,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced throughout Israel's ongoing military assault in the West Bank, with only 3,000 Palestinians returned to their homes. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, said that, quote, "We are witnessing new trails of tears in the West Bank, mirroring Gaza's fate." She was referencing the forced expulsion between 1830 and 1850 by the United States government of tens of thousands of indigenous people from their homeland east of the Mississippi toward what became Oklahoma, leading to the deaths of thousands. Albanese warned that a mass ethnic cleansing campaign is underway as Israel uses the fog of war to advance its long-standing objective of seizing Palestinian land. Quote, "The world, meanwhile, is pretending not to see history repeating itself," she said. For more, read Tamara's report, "Israel's Settlement Policy is a War Crime, Says UN," on electronicintifada.net. Meanwhile, Israeli raids on the Al Ain refugee camp near the northern city of Nablus on Wednesday have displaced more than 80 families, according to the Palestinian news agency Wafa. Ibrahim Shatawi, deputy head of the Al Ain Camp Services Committee, told Wafa that the occupation forces were storming houses in the camp, conducting searches, checking civilians' IDs, forcing them to leave at gunpoint before turning the houses into military barracks. The gun-toting soldiers detained a number of Palestinians from the camp. Shatawi added that an unidentified number of displaced persons sought refuge with relatives in neighborhoods within the city and others in mosques as the occupation forces continued to conduct a 3-day aggression, tightening their grip on the area. On Monday, the human rights group B'Tselem reported that masked Israeli settlers armed with clubs invaded the village of Susia in Masafariyata in the southern West Bank and began throwing stones at village residents who were herding sheep in the area. More residents gathered at the scene, including B'Tselem's field researcher Nasser Nawaja, who came to document the incident and call the police. In an attempt to defend themselves, the residents threw stones toward the attackers. During the incident, soldiers passed by in a civilian vehicle. They observed the event without intervening and continued driving. After about half an hour, a police officer arrived, allowed the settlers to leave, and detained Nawaja in a police car for about an hour. 2 residents were injured by stones in the attack. "I went over to the officer and complained that they were letting the settlers escape," Nawaja said. "The officer ignored me, but I insisted. He said to me angrily, 'You're under arrest,' and put me in the police car. We have lost our sense of security and safety. We are judged for simply existing on our own land," he said. And finally, it was hard to do this week, but I did find one video I wanted to share of Palestinian children expressing joy, determination, and resilience. This short video shows children engaging in the simple act of playing, recorded by the Gaza City-based journalist Yahya Sobieh. And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Thank you for the news in what is an extraordinarily difficult week after almost 18 months of difficult days and weeks. And I just want to reflect that it's common and true in a way that people were saying, oh, well, you know, there was never really a ceasefire because Israel was still killing people.
Yeah.
For the last 20 days, they have not allowed any food, medicine, humanitarian supplies of any kind into Gaza. But for people in Gaza, and everyone tells us this, it's not insignificant that since January 19th, they have not had the daily massacres of dozens of people
Yeah.
that we saw for the previous 16 months and that we've seen again since early Tuesday. More than 500 people killed, 200 of them at least children.
Yeah.
85 people killed today. So we're back to Joe Biden levels of genocide. And the impact of that on people in Gaza who were not living a normal life, but were living something other than this genocide. We have to acknowledge that. And for the rest of us, we all knew Israel could do this. And yet I know that I searched all the time for any glimmer of hope that there would be something other than this. And yet here we are, and it's devastating for everyone, first and foremost for people in Gaza. And I know that for many of our viewers and listeners, it's devastating. And thank you for sticking with us.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm just kind of constantly left speechless of, just in the last 48 hours, what has happened and the level of unconscionable brutality and psychotic violence that Israel is allowed to mete out on a population that has already been, as you said, starved, genocided for 15 months, besieged for 17 years. And the world is just sitting on its hands. World leaders, are sometimes issuing letters of condemnation, but letters won't stop Israel from enacting this genocide. And it's so painful to keep seeing what we're seeing and to know that our friends and colleagues can't escape this.
Yeah.
Anyway, we have a very packed show. Ali, why don't you bring on our first guest?
Yeah. Well, just a reminder that you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Ali Abubaker here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. And as we've just been hearing, Israel launched intensive attacks on Gaza early Tuesday, killing more than 500 Palestinians and injuring hundreds more as of this morning. At least 174 Palestinian children in Gaza were killed in Israeli airstrikes early this morning, marking one of the largest one-day death tolls since the beginning of the genocide, the human rights group Defense for Children International said on Tuesday. Joining us now to talk about the latest developments is Craig Mokhiber. He is a human rights lawyer with more than 3 decades of experience in a campaigner for justice. He served as the director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights until he resigned in late October 2023 to protest the world body's inaction in the face of Israel's unfolding genocide, which now is almost reaching its 18th month. Welcome back to the Electronic Intifada live stream, Craig.
Thank you very much, Ali and Nora. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
It's good to
Thank
have
you.
back.
Craig, on Wednesday, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz issued what he called a final warning to the citizens of Gaza. He said, quote, "The Air Force attack against Hamas terrorists was only the first step. The rest will be significantly worse, and you will pay the price. Soon, the evacuation from the fighting zones will resume. Unless all the Israeli hostages are released and Hamas is expelled from Gaza, Israel will act with forces never seen before. Take the US president's advice, return the hostages and expel Hamas. return the hostages and expel Hamas, and other options will be presented to you, including relocating to other places in the world for those who wish. The alternative is utter destruction and devastation. Those are the words of Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz. Craig, what's your reaction to that statement? What has been the world's reaction, and what should the reaction be?
Well, I think the only thing that you can say, as we've been saying all of these months, is that what you're hearing is the sound of impunity. That when you have a government official engaged in crimes against humanity and genocide who feels confident to broadcast directly a war crime, and let's be clear, under international humanitarian law, spreading terror among the civilian population is a crime. Secondly, what he is declaring is an act of collective punishment, which is also a war crime and a crime against humanity. So what we should first recognize is that what he's doing here is he's contributing to the cases before the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and hopefully someday cases through universal jurisdiction in the courts of others. He is committing crimes in public because the West, beginning with the United States, has guaranteed Israeli impunity. That can only be described as a Nazi-like statement. People are always very careful about the rhetoric that they use, but the last time we heard these kinds of direct threats of crimes against humanity against a civilian population was during World War II. And listen carefully to what he said. He was very explicit in not directing his statement to Hamas or to any armed resistance. He said that he was explicitly addressing the residents of Gaza, the civilian population. He's threatening them with, quote, total ruin, harsher attacks than they have already experienced, which have already broken the records for attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. And he said, you know, this is you, the residents, will bear the full cost of this. Needless to say, he threatened forced displacement and ethnic cleansing, which are also war crimes and crimes against humanity. And he said, even if they comply, they would face ethnic cleansing from Gaza. So this is a criminal act, promising further criminal acts in full public view because of the degree of impunity that has guaranteed. I am sure that those involved in the cases in the international tribunals are taking note of this additional crime being perpetrated, and hopefully we will see the day when these horrific human rights violators and, let's say it, Nazis will face the accountability that they deserve.
Craig, just to follow up on that, I mean, the International Criminal Court in The Hague has indicted Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, who was Israel Katz's predecessor as defense minister, and Gallant was defense minister during most of the genocide to date. Excuse me. Those arrest warrants don't seem to have deterred Netanyahu from escalating this genocide, hasn't deterred Israel Katz. I mean, is there any point to it? I mean, I know what you're going to answer, but I'm just expressing my own sense of exasperation that nothing seems to be able to stop them.
Well, it's clear they're not afraid. As I said, that's the sound of impunity that we're hearing. And they are confident that that impunity, guaranteed by the government of the United States of America and the taxpayers of the United States of America, will continue. But I think that there is hope that they will begin to feel. And remember, these are two indictments, two arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court with a promise of others to come. And it is impossible for the International Criminal Court, the case having been opened, to ignore crimes being perpetrated in public that relate to that. So you can bet that Katz is on a short list, as he should be. Will they be immediately arrested and brought to The Hague, as in the case of Duterte of the Philippines just several days ago? No, probably not. But they will feel the impact in their inability, as you know, to travel to to, over, or through other member states. And I believe the time will come when we will get our hands on at least some of these perpetrators. In the meantime, the historic record is being built. The case for accountability is growing, and little by little, and piece by piece, we're chipping away at the wall of impunity that Israel has enjoyed for all of these years. So, justice in the international sense grinds on too slowly, and certainly too slowly for those under the bombs and bullets of the Israeli regime. But it is moving. It is moving, maybe at a snail's pace. But this is not, this is not the world that we had 2 years ago. Now Israel is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court. Legal action being taken in national courts around the world. A wealth of evidence having been collected. Conclusions of every major international human rights mechanism, international human rights organizations, that Israel is perpetrating genocide. This is a level of accountability we did not see just a couple of years ago, and we have to keep at it. We have to keep at it, and we have to find ways to make sure that accountability bites. We don't have to wait for those courts to issue final decisions. We have other means at our disposal: boycott and divestment and sanctions and local prosecutions and education and advocacy and demonstrations and civil disobedience. But this just feeds, I think, the case for accountability, and we have to make sure that happens.
Craig, Germany, well known for its human rights record, has appointed its outgoing foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, as the next president of the UN General Assembly, a one-year position that could be a stepping stone to even more senior international roles for her. Germany was next in line to hold this job, and we can just remind people that Baerbock has been a leading supporter of Israel's genocide, openly spreading false atrocity propaganda in order to justify, even to the extent of lying, that she personally watched non-existent videos of Hamas fighters raping Israeli women on October 7th. What does it say about Germany and the broader EU and about the international system that someone like Baerbock can assume such a role?
Well, I won't be the first one to say this, but I think many people are coming to the conclusion that Germany never successfully denazified. When you see not just the active complicity of Germany in the genocide happening in Palestine, but characters like Baerbock, who go in public and just directly disseminate Israeli propaganda, false narratives. I mean, worse than that, in November, just a few months ago, she openly defended the killing of civilians in Gaza in a speech, the murder of civilians by the Israeli regime. And she tried to distort international law by saying that that civilians lose their protected status if Hamas is somewhere in the which is a complete and utter lie. Just ignore. So the government in Germany has shown that they are wholly complicit. They too have to be subject to accountability. Baerbock first among them. Now, the fact that they have put forward her candidacy, it doesn't surprise me that Germany has put forward her candidacy. It's it's what would be expected from a government of that kind. It is remarkable that the Europeans, and not just the Europeans, but the United States and Canada and others have gone along with it. They are part of a regional grouping. I've written about this group called 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in foreign policy and in focus. This is the Western European and other group. It is a group that includes not just, it's the only so-called regional group in the UN that is not regional. It is a white group, while the others are all regional, Africa and Asia and so on. And this group includes not just Europe, but Western Europe, but it also includes the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Israel. And it included for a time apartheid South Africa, because it is a white group. That's what 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is all about. And the way that these seats in the UN General Assembly and other intergovernmental bodies work is that they rotate through the regional groups, and basically they are usually not challenged because everybody gets a turn. That's the way that works. But 𝐓𝐶 could have chosen somebody other than Germany. The argument that it's their turn has been used over and over again to justify horrific elections, but the member states don't have to accept this. And I think that it's really important that a movement to show that there is a cost to the credibility of the General Assembly and the broader UN, if in the midst of a genocide, they actually elect a president of the General Assembly, the most democratic body in the UN because every state gets a vote, while she is complicit in the perpetration of a genocide. And during a period in which the General Assembly is going to be called upon to act in very strong ways in response to the genocide that's happening, that's unacceptable. So I hope that everybody who follows this program will make their voice heard publicly on social media, in communications to the General Assembly, and anywhere they have a platform, that it would be totally acceptable to have the General Assembly in the midst of a genocide presided over by someone complicit in that genocide.
Craig, this week you wrote on Twitter, X, in the face of an ongoing genocide in Palestine, the Trump administration is blocking action in the Security Council, smearing the UN Human Rights Council, threatening the International Criminal Court, attacking the International Court of Justice, slandering UN special rapporteurs, and criminalizing dissent at home, even as it ignores the orders of its own courts. You called the United States the #1 threat to the international rule of law today, and said that the global community of states must come together to oppose this. You just said that earlier that you see more accountability than 2 years ago, but do you see it happening to the extent it should? Where do you see action taking place, and where do you see governments failing in their responsibilities? In particular, talk about the other members of the UN Security Council and what they are doing and what you think they could or should be doing.
Well, I think the response of the collective 193 states around the world has been wholly deficient. But I think you have to sort of break it up into pieces. There's a group of states, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, some other Western states, who have actually joined Israel in actively perpetrating the genocide. That's one group. So these are the direct perpetrators in legal terms. Then you have a bunch of principally Western states who chose complicity in the genocide, but do it through supplying fuel or spare parts or diplomatic cover or other necessities for the continuation of the genocide. Not quite at the level of what the US and Germany and the UK are doing, but nevertheless in breach of their international legal obligations. You put those states together, which is basically the collective West, those two groups there, and you see that they have completely not just abandoned international law, but are working to oppose international law on behalf of one oppressive foreign regime in the Middle East. That's historically remarkable. Then you have a large number of states from all regions who have chosen basically to remain silent and passive. And that too is a breach of their international legal obligations, because the obligations they have, for example, to stop genocide or to enforce international humanitarian law, those are not passive obligations. They include an affirmative obligation to ensure respect, to take action within all of their areas of influence to make these violations stop. They're not doing that. They're not actively participating in the way that many Western states are. They're not directly perpetrating in the way the US is, but they're not doing anything to stop it. And that is a breach of their obligations. And these groups get smaller as you go along. There's a fourth group of states that have opposed the Israeli regime in public statements. They've taken diplomatic action, either in the way that they vote in the Security Council or bilaterally. They've taken diplomatic action in the General Assembly by voting in ways that oppose the genocide and the Israeli regime. Or they've joined cases against the perpetrators in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. They have a plausible argument that they are not in direct breach of their obligations. But there is only one group, and sadly the smallest group of all, that have actually taken concrete steps to actively meet their obligations under international law, to stop the genocide, to disarm the regime, to meet their obligations under international law. Foremost among these have been South Africa, which brought Israel to trial for genocide in the ICJ. And I have said arguably Hezbollah, because they have engaged Israeli forces militarily, initially in territory that was illegally occupied by Israel in the Sheva farms in South Lebanon, to draw Israeli military assets away from the genocide. And very significantly, the Yemen, the part of Yemen under Houthi control, which has enforced a blockade to prevent the resupplying of the Israeli regime. And they say to initiate their international legal obligations. And by the way, these are obligations that have been pronounced by the International Court of Justice, first in the Wall case, then in its series of provisional measures under the genocide case, and in its historic advisory opinion, telling all member states that they are legally obliged to stop any kind of support flowing to the Israeli occupation there as well. The rest of the world, clearly not doing what they're doing. Then you look at the international institutions, and here I have a great frustration as well. Yes, the Security Council was prevented from acting by the US veto. Although there are other things that they could do, there could be more mobilization there, but let's give them a partial pass because every time they try to do something meaningful, it's vetoed by the United States. There is the Uniting for Peace resolution that provides for emergency special sessions in the General Assembly, where there is no veto. They have taken important action in the adoption of an implementing resolution to implement what the International Court of Justice has said, including to calling on states to basically to carry out boycotts and divestment and sanctions, even though they don't have the Security Council to allow them to do it. But there is a lot more that the General Assembly could do. How is it that Israel, which is not only perpetrating a genocide in breach of its obligations, refusing to implement resolutions from a whole range of United Nations bodies, and attacking the United Nations again yesterday, not just with smears and slander, but with bombs and bullets, killing the largest number of UN staff in the history of the organization, destroying UN compounds and shelters and supplies, attacking UN convoys, declaring the Secretary General persona non grata, blocking activities by UN, seizing UN facilities. And yet it still has credentials in the United Nations General Assembly. Those credentials have to be pulled. The Israel has to be removed. The General Assembly has to do everything in its power to isolate the regime and thereby to move toward a resolution of the crimes that it is perpetrating. They have not done so. And then finally, I'll just stop since you've got me on a rant here. The senior political leadership of the UN, which was the focus of my critique when I left the organization in October of 2023, has absolutely abdicated its responsibilities under their mandates and under the norms and standards of the organization as defined in human rights treaties and other instruments. And they continue to play this game where they talk about both sides, some amorphous two-state solution in the future, humanitarian aid. They use conflict language in the way they address the situation, never talking about criminal accountability for the perpetrators in Israel, never talking about the root causes of settler colonialism, ethno-nationalism, supremacist ideologies, alien domination, inequality, the continuing occupation, and the genocide, a word that none of them have dared to even utter all these months into the genocide in Palestine.
I want to follow up on couple of things, Craig. First of all, to second your condemnation of the UN senior leadership, particularly Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, it's notable that even France condemned Israel's barbaric airstrikes on Tuesday. Even the EU condemned them. But Antonio Guterres did not condemn them. What he said, quote, "I am outraged by the airstrikes in Gaza." He didn't use the word condemn. Outrage sounds strong, but we know that these words are chosen carefully. He did condemn the attack I'm looking at his Twitter feed now. 4 hours ago, he said, "I strongly condemn Tuesday's attack targeting a convoy carrying President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed of Somalia, which resulted in casualties." So he knows the word exists. And yesterday he said, "I'm horrified by the death of and critical injuries of UN ops colleagues when their compound was struck in Gaza today. I condemn all attacks against UN personnel and call for a full investigation." So the only attacks he won't condemn are those that target Palestinians, including hundreds of Palestinian children who've been murdered. So I just wanted to note that. And I have something else, but go ahead and comment.
Yeah, I think his words are carefully selected, and the words of his spokespersons are carefully selected to avoid, and this was the trepidatious approach that I condemned in my letter and in my early appearances around this issue. He doesn't want to do anything that might upset the Americans or the Israelis or the Germans or the Brits. And so he will use every adjective to describe how horrific Hamas is and condemn them directly. He will use every adjective to describe, if he's talking about the Sudan or any other situation. And if he uses the word condemnation, listen carefully, in the rare cases where he uses it, or a spokesperson uses it, because I think he never does, they will say he condemns the deaths of those people. He won't condemn their murder, but he will condemn the fact that they died. Or he and his spokespersons will use generalization. So if they're pressed on it, they'll say the Secretary General condemns all violations of international law, right? By all parties in all situations. Well, congratulations. But you're not condemning this one. And he always sticks to the safe language that I was describing before. And frankly, so does the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is really remarkable because the High Commissioner for Human Rights has more political space than even the Secretary General because of the mandate that the High Commissioner is given on human rights questions. So the senior political leadership of the UN is not going to be reflected upon positively in history in terms of the way they reacted to this genocide. Before we even talk about, as we have before, Ali, these special advisor offices of the Secretary General on prevention of genocide, on sexual violence, on children in armed conflict, all of which have their words very carefully screened to preserve the Israel exception to international law.
I want to go back to what you said about Yemen, because you described Yemen as a country that you sort of put it at the top of the hierarchy of countries that are taking action or not taking action, in that it is fulfilling obligations under the Genocide Convention and under international law. Is that a fair summary of what you said?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we all know that Yemen is divided, that there are effectively two governments in Yemen, that the Houthis are only one, but they do control the capital. They do control most of the population of the country. They do have effective control of most of the resources of the armed forces, and they have control of the entry to.
But just to be clear, you as a human rights lawyer with 3 decades of experience and several decades in the UN, and your most recent position was as director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. You're saying that Yemen is acting to fulfill obligations in international law by imposing a blockade on Israel.
I am saying that, and of course, it's not a clear case because you have a disputed government. In fact, the Houthis are not recognized by the United Nations as the government, but they have been very clear, and they have demonstrated that the purpose of the blockade that they're imposing, first of all, is only directed at supplying the Israeli regime in the perpetration of its genocide and its siege in Palestine. And it has proven that that was the truth, because it discontinued the blockade during the so-called ceasefire. We can talk about whether that was a ceasefire, and only reinitiated it after Israel recommenced the expedited genocide and siege in Gaza. And there are, it's not like any of the 193 countries in the world are not aware that they have an obligation under international law to stop the supplying of the Israeli genocide in Palestine and to stop the supplying of its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, because the International Court of Justice has very clearly ruled that that is the obligation of all member states. And the General Assembly has adopted an implementing resolution just to make it perfectly clear that that is the responsibility of all member states. And some member states have explicitly accepted that, especially the Hague group of 9 states that have said, have committed to some specific acts to make sure that they no supplies run through their ports and get to Israel. And that is what Houthi Yemen has been doing. And what they are doing is, the U.S. says the reason it's attacking the Houthis is to protect commerce. Well, protecting commerce is not in the hierarchy of international law anywhere near the top. You have so-called jus cogens rules. You have erga omnes rules. Jus cogens means these are the top line rules that cannot be derogated. Erga omnes means that it imposes obligations on all states. And among those, you have the prevention of genocide as one of them. And the Houthis have said very clearly that's what they're doing, right? And I think they've proven it by stopping it during the ceasefire. So everybody knows what the law is, but very few states are actually meeting their obligations under the law. And there's no way to avoid the fact that that the Houthis are. Now, the Houthis don't have, they haven't gone to the Security Council to get permission to use force. And so, you will hear people saying, well, it's unlawful because they can't use force without that. Well, the United States doesn't have Security Council authorization to bomb Yemen. In fact, the bombing of Yemen is a war crime. It's the crime of aggression by the United States, which is slaughtering civilians in this poorest country in the region. Whereas what the Houthis are doing is they're imposing a blockade to stop ships from resupplying what is an unlawful occupation and a genocide. So, and they're doing, and this is in defense of the highest legal order. I'm not, a supporter of the Houthis. I don't share their politics. I don't share their view of the world. But when it comes to the blockade, they are one of very few states that are taking concrete action to give effect to obligations under international law to stop the resupply of the occupation and of the genocide. And if the United States or any other state wanted to say that what I'm saying is not true, then they could take the case to the International Court of Justice, either in a dispute, in a contentious case, or they could get the General Assembly to ask for an advisory opinion on whether this is the case. And I'll just say one more thing. We are at a moment in history when, because the U.S. is using its disproportionate power to block the international rule of law by preventing action by the Security Council and by attacking international judicial institutions and international UN institutions and so on. The question is, if you have a jus cogens norm, if you have an erga omnes obligation, and if there's one state, which is one of the perpetrators of the genocide, that is preventing those international institutions from functioning the way they're supposed to, what should a state that wants to meet its obligations do? And for the Houthis, they've decided they have control over the Bab al-Mandeb, the door of tears or lamentations, and it is adjacent to their territory. Some of it is in their territorial waters. They have the capacity to stop the resupplying of the genocide and the illegal occupation, and they're taking action in that regard and stopping that blockade when there is a ceasefire. This is my view.
Thank you for that, Craig. And that's very important in itself at a time when the United States is illegally attacking Yemen, murdering dozens of people there and threatening to do worse. And I think you've put forward a view that is important for people to hear. I just want to mention, and I hope that my lawyers in Switzerland won't get mad at me for revealing this, but one of the tweets that was used as a justification for arresting me, detaining me, and then expelling me from Switzerland in the end of January, that is in their documentation, was one in which I called Yemen's actions a humanitarian intervention. That was one of the bases that was put forward by the Zurich authorities for what they did. So you may or may not have inadvertently just turned yourself into an expert witness. I don't know.
Well, interesting to hear that coming from a place where I lived for much of my life in Switzerland. But Switzerland's conduct has been absolutely horrendous during this genocide. It's shameful for the country that is the depository state of the Geneva Conventions and is losing so much international legitimacy. I hope the cost is worth it to them.
Yeah. Well, Craig, I want to thank you so much. You always provide such important insight and knowledge. And we sometimes wait too long before having you back, but I hope we will have you back soon. Obviously, we hope this utter horror will end, but the search for justice and an end to impunity will go on for a long time. And your guidance, your thoughts, your analysis are incredibly valuable for all of us. And they keep our spirits up. Just you focusing on the law and how it can be a tool for justice, even in these moments of despair, is something we greatly appreciate. So thank you so much, Craig, and please come back soon.
My honor. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you so much, Craig. Incredible. Very, very necessary analysis, as always, by Craig on the utility of these international bodies and where we should be directing our advocacy and, appeals, even if it feels like they're all being, shoved into a void somewhere. But very, very, very important. Moving right along, you are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman here with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Quote, "My name is Mahmoud Khalil and I am a political prisoner. I am writing to you from a detention facility in Louisiana where I wake to cold mornings and spend long days bearing witness to the quiet injustices underway against a great many people precluded from the protections of the law." That's what the Columbia University graduate and student leader said in a letter dictated from the prison where he is still being held more than 10 days after U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested him from the university-owned apartment building where he lives in New York City on March 8th. Khalil adds, "My arrest was a direct consequence of exercising my right to free speech as I advocated for a free Palestine and an end to the genocide in Gaza, which resumed in full force Monday night. With January's ceasefire now broken, parents in Gaza are once again cradling two small shrouds, and families are forced to weigh starvation and displacement against bombs. It is our moral imperative to persist in the struggle for their complete freedom." The government's government's attempt to deport Khalil, which he is challenging in court, is part of an aggressive crackdown by the Trump administration targeting supporters of Palestinian rights. This morning, news broke that Badr Khansuri, a postdoctoral scholar at Georgetown University and a citizen of India, was arrested Monday night outside of his Virginia home by officers who identified themselves as Department of Homeland Security agents. According to his attorney, Suri was targeted because of his wife's, quote, "identity as a Palestinian and her constitutionally protected speech." This week, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of students Momodou Tal and Sriram Parasurma and Professor Mukoma wa Ngugi, whose activism in support of Palestine has put them at serious risk of political persecution. The lawsuit seeks a nationwide injunction to halt the administration's efforts to target and deport international students like these plaintiffs and Mahmoud Khalil. According to Eli Clifton, our next guest, the Trump administration's unprecedented decision to seek the deportation of Khalil, a U.S. permanent resident, without bringing any criminal charges, has an overlooked ally She is Miriam Adelson, the Israeli-American billionaire who is the largest financer of Trump's 3 presidential campaigns. Eli Clifton is a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute. He just wrote the article, "The Israeli-American Trump Mega Donor Behind Speech Crackdowns," for Responsible Statecraft, the publication where he is investigative journalist at large. He joins us now to talk more about Miriam Adelson's role. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you for having me.
It's really good to have you. And if you could just start by reminding us quickly who Miriam Adelson is and who her late husband Sheldon Adelson was. Where did they get their money from? And in broad terms, how have the Adelson family been using this money in recent years?
So the Adelson family, and specifically Sheldon Adelson, made billions of dollars, largely with his development of the Las Vegas Sands Corporation, which is a company based, as you might guess, in Las Vegas, Nevada. But it's important to keep that in mind. That owned at its peak, or certainly at the peak of its American presence, the Venetian Casino in Las Vegas. He's had sort of segued from running conventions in Las Vegas. The Comdex convention was something he helped spin up, and he turned this into a fortune worth, in excess of $30 billion, which is now, while it is still called the Las Vegas Sands Corporation, it really isn't in any sense connected to Las Vegas other than being based there. What it really is an Asian gaming company. Most of their casinos are in Macau, a special administrative region of China, and they have a casino in Singapore, the Marina Bay. But that doesn't mean that they have family. Sheldon Adelson died in 2021, but that his family, now led by his wife, Miriam Adelson, are any less active in American politics. If anything, they've scaled up their involvement. Miriam Adelson was born in Israel. She's an Israeli-American dual national, and that gets thrown around a lot, I should say, especially in circles where people are concerned about the influence of Israel, claiming that people are dual nationals, where in some cases they are not. And I think it's a dangerous thing to use that label when you can't prove it. It's in SEC filings. It's established that she holds dual citizenship. And the Adelsons themselves have been, and again, I think a lot of donors in the political space are very coy about what they want and who they are and why they give money. I think that's a bad thing. And I think the Adelsons, to their credit, certainly when Sheldon was alive and going on now with Miriam, are very outspoken about that their primary interest in being the largest donors to the Republican Party is really focused on Israel, that is their first and foremost concern. Maintaining zero daylight between U.S. administrations and Israel is really the most important thing to them, and the thing that they take a great deal of pride in their philanthropy as well as in their political donations. So I think that sort of sums up her role. She's time and time again, Miriam Adelson, and she's become more public since Sheldon's death in 2021. He used to speak for them more than she did. But it's very clear that she holds, if anything, views probably more hawkish and to the right of where he was in terms of what she thinks U.S. policy in the Middle East should be, and the fact that she sees Trump as sort of serving sort of a biblical function in defending Israel, which is kind of striking, again, coming from the person who has overseen the most political contributions going to Trump's entire political career, openly has written that she sees him, and the reason that she loves him so much isn't because of any of his domestic agenda or politics. It's really about his support for Israel, something that he delivered on in enormous ways in his first term, and that she regularly brings up. And that included delivering on the Golan Heights, abrogating from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something that, again, they had talked about quite a bit, as the family had wanted. And sort of the final step in that was that the Trump administration, this is the first Trump administration, wanted to make sure that whoever came next wouldn't be able to so easily move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. And the way that one of the steps they took was to sell the ambassador's home in Tel Aviv, and they sold it to the Adelson family. So that sort of tells you about what these people want, why they give their money, and again, they're very open about it.
And of course, Sheldon Adelson, who was U.S. born, an American citizen, famously said at one point that he'd served in the U.S. military during World War II, I believe, and he said he regretted that he had served in the U.S. military and not the Israeli military. So that gives you a sense of where their loyalties and priorities lie. But in your article for Responsible Statecraft, you write that tax documents reveal that Miriam Adelson is directly overseeing a social media campaign targeting Mahmoud Khalil and Columbia University through something called the Maccabee Task Force. I'll ask you, you could talk about what the Maccabee Task Force is and how it has been involved in the Trump campaign, but also what is Miriam Adelson's role in it?
I would just add, I don't think it was World War II. He was old. He wasn't that old.
It might have been. You may be right about that.
He did serve, though, and he did make those comments. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what the Maccabee Task Force is something that was started in 2015 with a pretty modest donation from the Adelson family. They donated a little bit over $2 million to an organization that was going to be focused on college campuses. And they, quote, said it was to combat disturbing spread of anti-Semitism on college campuses. But they were pretty clear, again, from the launch, what that really meant. And they said that it really was focusing on rolling back the perceived successes of the boycott, divest, and sanctions, the BDS campaigns against Israel, which Maccabee Task Force characterizes as, quote, an anti-Semitic movement that crosses the line from legitimate criticism of Israel into the dangerous demonization of Israel and its supporters. So again, they're pretty upfront about what they were doing, why they were doing it, what the motivation was. And Maccabee Task Force, it really scaled up. And eventually they brought over David Brogg, who was the head of Christians United for Israel. He came over to run it. And really it started with that modest contribution. Between when they launched in 2023, the last year that there are publicly available tax filings for the group, the Adelsons had put in nearly $70 million into it. And again, this is happening alongside, and I think this is meaningful, the Adelsons being the largest donors to Trump's political career, as well as to the Republican Party, to congressional races, to gubernatorial races. They are the biggest donors. Elon Musk might be challenging them on that right now. But again, when you look back several cycles, they've put in nearly $600 million in reported political contributions. That's not dark money that they might be putting in also. So these guys are very meaningful political political donors. And the Maccabee Task Force, really springs to life with the college campus protests about Israel's war in Gaza. Partially because it's very much in their wheelhouse. This is what they were designed for, was to push back. And I think, again, credit where credit is due, I think Maccabee Task Force pretty accurately identified back in 2015 that college campuses and the next generation and young people and academics were probably going to be on the forefront of challenging the unconditional U.S. support for Israel. And indeed, they were clearly right as the protests about the war in Gaza scaled up, particularly at Columbia University, which had become the poster child for it. And that's where Maccabee Task Force, again, looking at their social media posts, which I sort of looked at, really the more recent ones even, although I know they've been very active over the past couple of years, had been focusing their efforts, was to say that what went on at Columbia went beyond what is acceptable speech, that it went beyond certainly the rules of what the university abides by, that it went beyond what the federal government should be allowing any federal funds to go towards supporting. All things which ultimately the Trump administration chose to follow up on with Columbia University, with the arrest and attempted deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. But we can talk about what those social media posts said and the fact that they went after Khalil in ways that when I reached out to Maccabee Task Force, they chose not to respond. Since I asked them, do you have evidence? You said you called him a Hamas supporter. You said he came to the U.S. to promote chaos and destruction. These are pretty close to saying that he was providing material support for terrorism, which is indeed a felony. A felony he was not charged with. Maccabee Task Force chose not to respond to those questions. But to bring us back to Miriam Adelson and why this is particularly notable, Maccabee Task Force website lists out who their staff are, lists out David Brogg and his involvement in his leadership of the group, lists out a lot of their staff. But it doesn't list who their president is, the head of the organization. And that's only in IRS tax documents that Maccabee Task Force has to file each year. And what that reveals is that Miriam Adelson isn't just their biggest donor. She's also the president of the group. So she's, Donald Trump's biggest donor, biggest supporter, the biggest supporter of the Republican Party, is actually in the leadership, the leader of a very outspoken group targeting individual students on college campuses, cheering on attempts to deport them, making unsubstantiated claims that would suggest that they are providing material support to Hamas. And that, I think, is a pretty potent cocktail of power and money and political influence.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's, Maccabee is one of, as you mentioned, several well-funded groups like this that have been operating on college campuses for decades, spying on students and faculty, trying to develop relationships with, or have developed relationships with lawmakers, both local and national, and threatening students' families, and now, trying to get people deported for having an opinion, a political opinion. Can you talk about specifically the Mahmoud Khalil case in this context, and what the Maccabee Task Force has specifically done to try and throw everything they can at Mahmoud Khalil and the precedent that it sets and what they're trying to do in that case?
Well, they didn't just go after it. Certainly, a lot of their social media posts over the past several weeks have been a combination of cheering on the detainment and efforts to deport Khalil, but also swinging at Columbia University and cheering on the defunding of Columbia University by the Trump administration. And I would say, like, it borders the line into just sort of crass social media posts. They have an enormous following on Facebook, over 300,000 followers. And one of their posts said, fuck around and find out. The sad truth is that the administration at Columbia couldn't even be bothered to pretend to care about the safety of Jewish students until the White House threatened the prospect of losing $5 billion. And so they're making wild claims against Columbia University and cheering on the defunding. When it came to Mahmoud Khalil, they claimed he was a Hamas supporter. Again, couldn't provide any evidence. They said that deporting Khalil after wreaking havoc at Columbia University campus is a positive step in the right direction. And they claimed, again, without providing any evidence, that Khalil came to the U.S. to promote chaos and destruction. These are pretty extreme claims against somebody when there are no criminal charges that have actually been filed. And one thing I do want to point to with their social media campaign and this targeting of an American university and targeting of an American permanent resident, Mahmoud Khalil, in such specific and again throwing out these unsubstantiated claims against both Khalil and Columbia, are that when you go in and you look closely at the Facebook page for Maccabee Task Force and you look at who manages it, they have something called the page transparency on Facebook that will not give you specifics about who the managers of the page are, but it will tell you sort of some basic information, such as how many people they are and where in the world they are. And what that revealed was that 2 out of the 7 managers of the Facebook page are based in Israel. And again, I think that's a pretty, we need to stop and reflect on that for a moment, that there are individuals in Israel managing what is supposed to be an organization focused on American college campuses, largely comprised supposedly of American college students, that is singling out both students and universities for unsubstantiated vitriolic attacks because of efforts to I could only describe as an effort to stifle free speech about American foreign policy towards Israel. That's pretty scary that folks in Israel are involved in actively trying to make an example out of American permanent residents and American universities for daring to permit or to engage in constitutionally protected speech critiquing American foreign policy.
And that's really, I thought, a really significant thing that you found and is in your article at Responsible Statecraft. And it reminds me of the revelations that were in Al Jazeera's documentary, The Lobby USA, which, of course, Al Jazeera, perhaps, well, certainly after a pressure campaign from the lobby, never broadcast. Ironically, the Israel lobby didn't want a documentary about the lobby broadcast because they said it's full of lies and the lobby doesn't have any real power. And that same lobby managed to get Qatar somehow not to broadcast, or to pressure Al Jazeera not to broadcast the documentary. But in 2018, this was in 2018, the Electronic Intifada obtained copies of the documentary, and we published them. In fact, you can find them on our YouTube channel. But one of the key things that documentary revealed was how the Israeli government was directing and coordinating the campaign to suppress speech on American campuses. This was done through something called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs that was working directly with US-based groups, including the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a far-right neocon group that whose main job, it seems to be, is to advocate for war with Iran, and other groups like that, the Israel on Campus Coalition, and so on. In terms of sort of bringing it back to what's happening now with the crackdown, I reported last week on another extreme Zionist organization called Betar USA, and how it has been identifying and inciting against individual students, including Mahmoud Khalil, that it wants to see deported. Betar even brags about compiling dossiers about students and passing them on to the Trump administration. Do you have a sense of how coordinated these types of efforts are now, and how much collusion there is between the US government and these extreme pro-Palestinian groups, whether it's the Maccabee Task Force or Betar or any others? Do we know more about that than we learned, say, in the Al Jazeera documentary?
I mean, look, I think what you're certainly seeing is an echoing of talking points and accusations, both back and forth between the US government and these groups. And it cycles back and forth. The thing that I find the most concerning about these groups, and maybe Maccabee Task Force, again, is the exception rather than the rule here, is how most of them actively conceal who is behind them. That these are groups that have now taken the steps of cheering on, frankly, what is going to turn into, a severe challenge to the First Amendment. I hope the courts will rule that that indeed this is protected political speech, and you can't target a U.S. permanent resident for engaging in this sort of speech. But that is where we are at. And these groups are cheering it on, and they're doing it largely while concealing who they are and who's behind it. And in the case of turning back to Maccabee Task Force, the fact that they are tied to the president's biggest donor, the fact that they are tied to somebody who is very clear that they are engaged in a transactional relationship with Donald Trump when it comes to Israel, and is doing so with a huge amount of wealth and power at their disposal, is really scary. And you add into that the fact that it's not just that they are very much identify as being Israeli or indeed an Israeli citizen. But the fact that the actual that person is the president of Maccabee Task Force, but there's that added element that the actual nuts and bolts of this campaign targeting, again, U.S. permanent residents, targeting entire institutions like Columbia University, are actually being executed and orchestrated by people in Israel. That's what we are seeing from that page, transparency of their Facebook page. And I think that what that really brings home, to sort of zoom out, and I see up in the corner it's day 531 of the war in Gaza, is to start to think about the fact that we mostly talk about the cost of this war in terms of American credibility in the world, American ability to talk about human rights when we're complicit in this war that's taken tens of thousands of innocent civilian lives. And we talk about the monetary cost, which is also real, that the United States, through what it provides to Israel in support. But this is starting to show another cost. There's another cost of this war that is coming home, which is that the support for the war is going down. The Gallup poll from earlier this month said that less than half of people in the U.S. now are sympathetic toward the Israelis in this war. It's been a slow but steady decline in support for Israel's war in Gaza. So the steps that the people that want to maintain U.S. support for it are going to have to undertake is going to get more extreme. And that's what we're starting to see now. It's starting to impose real costs. It's starting to challenge what we consider to be, core American values and rights, our civil liberties, our ability to dissent, our ability to challenge U.S. foreign policy, to challenge any government policy, not just foreign policy, to take what we take for granted, which is that we should be able to question the United States' relationship with any country in the world, not just Israel. That this is constitutionally protected, and that it's culturally part of who we are. Groups like Maccabee Task Force, groups like Beitar, groups like Canary Mission, they don't want that. They want to stifle that form of speech. And that's coming at a very real cost. Colombia is looking at being defunded by billions of dollars. Khalil is looking at being deported. It's something that is a real cost. Badr Khansouri at Georgetown is looking at potentially being deported for his wife's statements. It's just incredible to think the challenges that are being put up towards what we consider to be protected forms of speech inside this country, and that is a cost of this war, and a cost that I think now we are starting to have to pay because, again, public support continues to decline. So they're going to have to use more and more coercive methods to maintain the status quo.
And those are such important points, and it's something that's been going on for years. And people tend to exceptionalize Trump because he's taking it further than others have before. But it's important to remember that the demonization of free speech about Palestine has been going on for years, under Democratic and Republican administrations, and from Democratic and Republican members of Congress. And since we mentioned it, I just want to show people, because we have many people who are coming to this issue new, the documentary, the Al Jazeera documentary, which you can find at the Electronic Intifada on our YouTube channel, or if you search just on a search engine, watch the film The Israel Lobby Didn't Want You to See, you will be able to watch that censored documentary revealing direct Israeli government intervention in efforts to stop free speech, particularly on American campuses. I just wanted to mention that. And Eli, we're very grateful to you for your time today. And just to remind people that you are a researcher at the Quincy Institute, and you are an investigative journalist. I've been following your work for many years. You have a particular interest and knack in pulling out really important facts from very boring tax filings, and I've learned a lot from you in doing that.
They're terribly scintillating.
but that's where the secrets are buried, so to speak. And your article in Responsible Statecraft the Israeli-American Trump mega donor behind speech crackdown is really important reading. And thank you for coming on to talk about it today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eli. Fantastic work. Yeah, I mean, it's really important to keep connecting these dots and following the money trail, following the influence trail. And, you know, I mean, these groups, you know, as I mentioned, have been just chomping at the bit to finally get all university administrations to ban speech on Palestine. There is the Palestine exception to free speech that we've been talking about for decades. Yeah, I just really encourage everyone to go read Eli's piece. And we will, of course, be updating the situation on Mahmoud Khalil and all of these other academics and researchers that are being persecuted by the U.S. government. We have a special guest. Before we go to John's resistance report, I wanted to bring on our guest, Abubaker from Gaza. Abubaker, are you there?
Yeah, hello.
Hi, friend. How are you?
Yeah, really good.
Hi,
Thank you so
Abubaker.
much. Hi, Dr. Ali.
Tell us about the last 48 hours in Gaza. You know, on early Tuesday morning, the area that you and your family live in was pounded heavily by Israeli airstrikes. Can you
Much
talk
of
about
Gaza, much of Gaza, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and much of Gaza, from the north to the south. Can you talk about what happened Tuesday and what's going on today since dawn?
Yeah, it's a very tragic situation. Like, we were about to sleep on that day, and then all of a sudden, four explosions happened in my area, because Del Balah was the first place hit by the Israeli military on that day. So it was the start of the series of the airstrikes. So there were four very, very powerful blasts that shook the entire area at that time. My family was partially awakened, and so was I. It was terrifying, so horrifying. After that, the artillery shelling also started simultaneously with the airstrikes, and then an airstrike after another airstrike, and the artillery shelling from Israeli tanks, the live rounds, the projectiles, having to stop it all. So yeah, we lived in constant horror for 24 hours. And then my sister in the northern parts of the Strip, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that she's now trapped in the north, and she could not really come back or the south of the Strip and unite with us, unfortunately. So Elul, her mother, her father, and the other nephew of mine are all trapped in northern Gaza under the most incredibly harsh circumstances that someone can really imagine. And this situation for today, so we have an update from the Gaza Ministry that 591 people have been killed during the past 48 hours. The number continues to rise. The scenes here at Al-Aqsa Mother's Hospital are incredibly horrific and terrifying. The pile, the corpses are everywhere. The blood is everywhere. So we got back to where we were because, you know, Israel continues killing Palestinians en masse, and Israel continues bombing everywhere. The Israeli tanks are unceasingly shelling Deir al-Balah, shelling central Gaza. It's super horrifying. And it's not only this, because right now a low pressure front is hitting Gaza. The strong waves of the wind are blowing away the tents of people. One of the tents near our home was totally blown away. People have ended up on the streets. So Gazans are tied to those words: displacement, grief, suffering, pain, starvation, and that continues. So it's incredibly heartbreaking.
Abubaker, this renewed massacre, and we saw one of the worst single-day death tolls since the start of this genocide on Tuesday, and a return of horrific massacres. But for the previous more than 2 weeks, Israel has also been starving Gaza from food, medicine, fuel, electricity, which wasn't coming to ordinary people anyway, but was being used to run desalination plants. So what little water, fresh water is available they were also trying to cut water off from people. Talk about the impact that has been having on you, on people in Gaza, this this genocide by starvation.
Yeah, no, we have the entirety of the population have resorted to canned food. So for today's iftar, we just ate some lentil soup, and that is, of course, a symptom of the ongoing blockade by Israel and the closure of the two crossings. So people don't have any choices right now. There are no vegetables in the markets, probably very, very few quantities, a trickle of vegetables inside Gaza's markets, and no fruits, no meat, no fishes, nothing of all of that. So it's just a repetition of something that we were enduring before in the past 15 months, and it's back again. And unfortunately, the reopening of the crossings doesn't seem imminent, and probably the closure will take much, much more time until it can be lifted. So it's very heartbreaking. Like most families right now end up without any meals because, again, we go back to the same point, which is that people cannot really afford buying vegetables. Vegetable like one potato costs $4, an eggplant costs $3, one tomato costs $3, one onion costs $4. How would you want people to afford? How would you want an entire population, more than 80% of them have lost their work since the start of the genocide? How would you want them to afford these extremely exorbitant prices? So people instead have canned food, and they have the lowest quality of food to eat. They have resorted to using bug-infested flour, old flour, because there is no flour inside the territory at all. The humanitarian organizations, the work of them has been halted after they were denied by the Israeli military inside Gaza. People here don't know what to do, but people are very afraid. I can tell you, I'm so sorry to say this, they're very frightened of this phase 2 of the genocide. They don't want to go back to this sheer horror again and again, because they wanted to rebuild something. They wanted to restart their new lives during the ceasefire, although it was multiple times violated by the Israeli army. But now their dreams destroyed again, their lives being taken very mercilessly. So what do you want from people? What else Israel is going to destroy in Gaza? So what would be left for the population outside the Gaza, for the entire world, to do something and stop this barbarism, stop this fiendish situation unfolding inside Gaza? So people in Gaza cannot really blot out their pain. They cannot really vent their pain, because their pain is being compounded every single day. Our pain is being compounded every single day. During the ceasefire, students went back to their work, to their studies, to their schools, to their universities. People started to rework again. They started to rebuild. They started to reopen their markets and their restaurants. All of that out of a sudden has vanished. So it's a tragic, it's miserable, and it's inconceivable. I don't know what to say anymore, but hopefully we're not going to go through this anymore. It can be reached very soon.
We hope that too, of course. Abubaker, we don't want to take up too much of your time because the internet is really spotty, and it's getting late there for you. But a medical worker in Gaza, and I quoted this in the news report at the top of the show, said that because of the siege, because of the last 3 weeks of the closing of the crossings, on top of the humanitarian aid, the basic medications and medical equipment not being able to be let in 17 months, that people who arrive at the hospitals after massacres like the ones that we've been seeing the last 48 hours, that an injury is a death sentence. Can you talk about what capacity hospitals and clinics are able to work at under these conditions right now, what you know about the medical catastrophe right now.
Yeah, my family, my parents in particular, need proper medications, specific medications that I really searched for all around Gaza, in the north, in the south, and here in central Gaza, but I didn't find them. And not only my parents, because the vast majority of the population have the same painful, excruciating story, because Gaza's pharmacies do have the very simple medications for Gazans. So it's something that people cannot really understand or comprehend. And I talked to doctors from Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital and from Al-Awda Hospital. They told me that they are right now dealing with the bare minimum, with less than the bare minimum in their hands, because there are no medical supplies, there are no basic necessities to treat the influx of casualties that is coming every single hour from different parts of the strip that are continuously being hit by the Israeli military, from drones, from gunships, from boats, military boats, or from quadcopters and the fighter jets. So the scale of injuries is very hard to treat and is very hard to deal with, because, you know, we're talking about that the hospital is being inundated with the number of injuries, and the injuries continue to rise, and the vast majority of them are children. I saw children here around me, they have sustained life-changing injuries, and they have, like, their lives have ended here, because I'm sorry to say this, but death for them is much better than having a life-changing injury amid such incredibly harsh and difficult circumstances with no medications and no medical supplies. Now, we understand from Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital that 15% of the injuries over the course of the past hours, as they spoke to local media or international media, that 15% of those injuries succumbed to their wounds. So you can see and you can imagine how difficult it is to deal with such injuries. And not only this, because the doctors told me that it comes sometimes to a point that we don't have the gauze, we don't have the scissors to stitch up the wounds, or to even give solutions to those who are wounded people. And now it's the same scenario. Blood splashed all over the floor, a lack of beds, medical beds, people are being treated on the floor, and it's just like repeating itself again. Nothing hasn't changed, because Israel has been sorry, Israel has been blocking aid and medical supplies even during the ceasefire, and did not adhere to the humanitarian protocol that should have secured the entry of all those medical supplies and medical devices. So the devices that are needed, like the X-ray devices, are not found. The generators are running out of fuel. There is a fuel crisis, and we cannot run the generators, we cannot run the hospitals very properly. There are no devices, and specific wards of the hospitals are operating right now, so not the entirety or the whole hospital is working. So it's unimaginable that those doctors, there is also a scarcity of medical staffers, so there's a scarcity of experience among or within those medical crews who are working on those patients or on those who are wounded people. This is apart from the fact that most of the population have contracted weak immune, or have contracted infections from the environment. The Gaza, the places in the landscape of Gaza is filled with sewage, stagnant pools of sewage and garbage that has made for infections to spread very widely around them. So we have many cases like gastroenteritis, hepatitis A virus, and other diseases. People now, the immune system of them has become so weak, and they don't have multivitamins, they don't have a nutrition, they don't have anything. So everyone, not Nora, those who are wounded by the war or by the genocidal regime, but it's also about that everyone in Gaza is slowly serving a death sentence right now, because it's a starvation, it's relentless bombardment, and at the same time it's horrific circumstances, because the vast majority of the population live in very leaky, flimsy, dilapidated tents under the worst circumstances ever to be imagined, and their trauma is being compounded because people are trying to recover from the unending trauma, the cycle of grief and agony they have been through during the genocide. I know people that that they haven't yet recovered the bodies of their loved ones from under the rubble. And now some of them whom I know have been killed during the first 2 days. And in addition to that, not only this, I know people who have been desperate for medical evacuation. Right now, the crossings are closed, so they are just a few meters away, a few minutes away. They are on the cusp of imminent death. So this is the tragedy. You shouldn't really stay out of the weeds. You have to get deep into what Gaza is like right now, because you have been aware for the past 15 months. Now, it's not your time to just keep watching and saying that we watch this and we watch this, we watch this. We need actions on the ground, because if this goes on, Gaza will be literally erased from the north to the south. But the people of Gaza stay committed to their hope, to their beliefs, and that they will continue. But when everyone is letting them down and everyone is leaving them alone, what would you expect from an entire population? Half of them is just the children, who are spending their whole day outside in the streets, barefoot, with one piece of clothing on their bodies, and they don't have food. And their families, most of the children have lost their parents. Yesterday in Deir al-Balah, I'm aware of at least 5 children who have lost their parents, and right now they don't know where they can be brought. So they are just thrown inside an Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital with no care, with no one being beside them. So there is no sign of hope at the moment. There's no sign of life, and people do hope and do pray for an end to this and a return to a sense of normality they've been always longing for. And hopefully the hope of Palestinians will continue to spread and shine. And we want to make sure that Gaza is going to be rebuilt. That's the very most important thing. You need to act.
No. We hear you loud and clear, Abubaker. We need to act. I know that many of our viewers and listeners are acting and are hearing you, and we hear you loud and clear, and we really don't have words to express how much sorrow and pain we have. And we know that people in Gaza are exhausted after almost 18 months of genocide. And even during the so-called ceasefire, even though there weren't the daily massacres, life wasn't easy. And so they faced this renewed horrific bombardment in a position where they're already weakened in terms of their health. And even though we can't compare our situation to that of people in Gaza, many of us feel after 18 months that we've been speaking, we've been acting, and we see this still going on. But what I want to assure you, Abubaker, and I hope you carry this message to people around you, is that we won't give up and we won't leave you and we won't be silent no matter what the cost. And we hope to see that day very soon where this ends and Gaza is rebuilt. And in the meantime, we hope you stay safe. We are grateful for your reporting, which you continue to do all the time on your social media accounts, on Twitter and on other outlets. Yeah. And I just want to please urge you to be as careful as you can.
I am, but there are 3 things that I want to mention very, very quickly. The first thing, it's very painful that Deir al-Balah and Central Gaza right now, they don't have a single drop of potable water, because the desalination plants have been taken out of service completely because of the fuel crisis. So what does it mean? The people are now do not find places to go for or to go and find potable water, because Israel has done this, has cut off electricity to the strip, and they are just showing up to the media and talking about their genocidal intents, and no one is stopping them. The second thing, I'm a brother of a sister. My sister is in the north. The feeling of the separation is very, very intimidating and very, very, very heartbreaking. Something that people have to know. Imagine that your sister, you cannot really visit her, you cannot really see her, you cannot really call her, because the northern parts of the strip are almost taken out of the entire world. They are cut off from the entire world. These things people have to know. And thirdly, when we talk about the American audience, Dr. Ali, you are paying for my suffering. You have to know that. So it comes as your priority that your government is the first responsible entity that is funding and sponsoring my suffering right now and the killing of my people and the pain that is creeping into my heart and the painful memories that I cannot really take myself away from. So Americans do have to stand as the first people, and they do have to lead the actions to make sure that Gaza is not going to bleed again, because we have bled enough. So what's more, like 60,000, more than 60,000, we're talking about more than 80,000. So what's more left? Like, I don't know what else Gaza has to bleed, or what else Gaza has to sacrifice until you make sure that Gaza is going to have its life again. So it's barbaric, it's unimaginable, and beyond fiendish, beyond heartbreaking. So these feelings that we are still recovering and rehabilitating from, we want to make sure that we have a better life and we can replace these feelings. So just to the audience, because I'm sure like every American has a conscience and you have a conscience, but feel us, feel our pain and feel what we have. But again, like I'm saying it again, I'm very depressed to see that it is day 531. Last time we spoke, it was day 1 of the ceasefire, or day 14 of the ceasefire. So this itself, this simple sign that people are not aware of, really breaks me to some extent. But again, I'm a very hopeful person. I will not lose this hope, because whatever happens to me, and I told you that, and I'm keeping telling the audience all the time, whatever happens to me, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to smile and I'm going to hope until the very last moment. But it comes to a point that it's enough. You are funding the genocide. You're funding my suffering. So do not play a part in that. Refuse that. I'm not asking for anything more. Why should we keep ourselves stuck in the same cycle of suffering? So I hope everyone is turns, and I'm sending my hope, love, and smile to every one of you. Thank you.
We're also broken, Abubaker. It breaks us too, and but you are the hope. You are our hope, and yeah. Again, like Ali said, please don't take any unnecessary risks. Please be as safe as you can. I know that seems insane, and that's what we've been saying to you for the last year and a half. But we're all with you.
And we hope to talk to you
Inshallah.
soon.
Yeah.
In better circumstances, God willing.
And for risks, believe me, Nora, if there is a risk in Gaza, you are the safety that floats through us. Make sure of that. You are the safety that floats through us.
Such a poet.
Thank you.
Abubaker.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Abubaker. We're praying for your safety
Love
and
it.
for everyone in Gaza. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
It's hard
taking
to
a moment.
imagine
Yeah.
what people are going through. And I've had many messages from friends and colleagues in Gaza saying, we're just overwhelmed. Like they thought, I mean, it's not like anyone is naive about what Israel is and what it can do, but they really believed and hoped that this was behind them, that there would be no going back to this.
Right.
And here we are.
Here we are. Well, let's bring on Jon. Hey, Jon.
Hi, guys. It's always a tough act to follow.
I know.
It's good to see him, though.
Yeah.
He's been doing a lot of good work. He sure is out there.
He's unstoppable. Speaking of unstoppable, you have some news about the Ansar Allah, the Yemeni armed forces, and also, I mean, whatever you can say, however you can analyze what we're seeing on the ground right now in Gaza. Yeah, what a week. You okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. I hope you guys are okay over there. You guys are doing the heavy lifting on these emotional interviews, so you do a great job.
Thanks. All right, we'll take it away, Jon.
All right. All right, so this is the Resistance Report for day 531. I'm Jon Elmer reporting. It is March 20th today. The ceasefire has officially ended, as you have been hearing throughout this program, the Electronic Intifada live stream. But we've been reporting for all of the past 9 weeks that the ceasefire was being structurally violated by Israel all the way throughout. More than 1,000 violations. More than 150 Palestinians were killed on a day-by-day basis throughout the so quote unquote ceasefire, the ceasefire that Israel uses, like they did in Lebanon, to hold on to territory that they couldn't capture during the battles on the ground. On March 2nd, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the blockade, the total sealing of Gaza that Abubaker was just talking about, that has prevented more than 10,000 aid trucks into the Gaza Strip, along with 850 fuel trucks. And now those numbers are agreed upon numbers from the first phase of the ceasefire that was conditioned upon the return of Israeli captives. So those Israeli captives are at home. They're back in their homes, and the agreement that Israel signed in order to get them there has been violated structurally by Israel. And those 850 fuel trucks are the fuel trucks that are needed for the ambulances, for the civil defense crews to deal with what is now begun again, the full-scale massacre of people in Gaza. The war resumed hand in hand with the United States attack on Yemen. Israeli officials and American officials both said that, and the Israeli officials that said it under a military censor. So it's obviously something that they wanted their population and the world to know, that it was hand in hand. Benjamin Netanyahu said from now on, negotiation will take place only under fire. I will cover Yemen in a few moments, but first, let's start with Gaza, because on Monday at 2 a.m. local time, Israel carried out a simultaneous surprise attack in the middle of the night, hitting 80 civil and government infrastructure targets in less than 10 minutes. The targets were human targets and physical targets. It was a wave of assassinations against senior government officials in the Hamas government, in the municipal government, in the Politburo, people who live out in the open, who are administering the territory. This is not some kind of intelligence coup that the Israelis pulled off. It's a heinous massacre, a cowardly massacre, even by Israel's standards, to strike at 2 a.m. without any warning while people are at home with these, and their families were massacred alongside these government officials, in many cases elected government officials that run the ministries, all of the key ministries in the Gaza Strip. And Israel said that's what they were doing. They were targeting government ministers. And there's reasons why this at this particular moment, why these attacks are particularly cowardly and particularly appalling. And it's because people have returned back to their homes, such as they are. In the fraction of the homes that remain in Gaza, people are concentrated in those homes in larger numbers. They're struck in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. in the morning. And that's why you have the death tolls, like Nora reported in the newscast off the top, with hundreds of children, because that's the proportion in Gaza of the child population. And so just brutal massacres. They're very, even after 530 days of watching this, these particular attacks this week have been appalling. I just wanted to say that before we get into the resistance report. Abu Ubaidah today, after rockets were fired out of Gaza for the first time, the first time that there has been a breach of the ceasefire by the Palestinian side, because Israel said the ceasefire is over. Before that, there was zero violations by Palestinians. In fact, they actually were accommodating to Israel's demands throughout the prisoner exchange, the way the prisoners were released. They responded to that. They responded by having constantly be involved in negotiations, even though those negotiations were used as tools to start the war again. Hamas participated in those negotiations in good faith. Well, this morning they fired for the first time rockets on Tel Aviv. They fired M90s from Khan Yunis, from southern Gaza. And Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for the Qassam Brigade, said, "We salute our sincere brothers in Yemen for their honorable stance and direct support for the people in Gaza, despite the heavy price they are paying for their loyalty to Palestine. Today, Yemen's missiles intersected in the air with Gaza's missiles over the skies of Tel Aviv, confirming that Gaza is not alone and that behind it are free men and a free nation who will not surrender to its arrogant enemies." As I said, I'll talk about Yemen coming up, but we're going to focus on Gaza here. And like I said, Netanyahu and the security establishment made clear that negotiations will now be under fire. And the death toll this week is climbing well over 500 now. More than 400 of those were on the first day of the massacres that were tied to assassinations. Also, yesterday, the Israeli military issued evacuation orders on the eastern edge of Gaza, expanding their buffer zone. They moved into the Netzarim corridor again, cutting off Salahuddin Road, the main north-south thoroughfare through Gaza, again, as Nora reported. So that is 1/3 of the Netzarim corridor has been reoccupied. And the targets have been on school shelters, people in their homes, and of course in tents as well, because government officials are living in tents as well, just like the doctors, just like the journalists, just like the aid workers that you see living in tents, living in those tent communities. But one of the assassinations that took place was of Abu Hamza. We can pull up Abu Hamza here. His name is Naji Abu Saif. He is the spokesperson for 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐿 Islamic Jihad. Israel did not take credit for this assassination. Not clear from their perspective. They were bragging about massacring government officials, but the Islamic Jihad movement came out and right away acknowledged the death of Abu Hamza, who people will be familiar with, who spoke throughout this war. And this is the notice from Islamic Jihad. It says, "With great pride and honor, the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine announces to our great Palestinian people and the peoples of the Arab and Islamic nation the martyrdom of Naji Abu Saif Abu Hamza, the spokesperson for 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐿, the military wing of Islamic Jihad. He was assassinated by the criminal army in a treacherous attack that targeted his family and his brother's family in their homes. The media knew and the people knew the martyr as the voice of the resistance, a fearless and eloquent and bold and heroic, known for his bold and heroic stances, expressing the resistance and defending the rights of the Palestinian people. This treacherous and hateful assassination perpetrated by the criminal entity was part of a brutal series of massacres that have shed the blood of hundreds of innocent, including children and women, over the past few hours. This massacre, supported and encouraged and funded by the United States administration and met with helpless and cowardly silence from the world, will only increase our resolve and determination and perseverance in defending our people and our rights, and the goals of the aggression will be completely thwarted." So Abu Hamza has been an articulate spokesperson for the resistance for many years. He, particularly through the Great March of Return that happened in 2018 and 2019, when civil actions at the fence surrounding Gaza went on for more than a year and a half. He spoke through all of those. And of course, he spoke through all three of the wars in the last 3 years that include 2021's Guardian of the Walls. 2022, there was a rocket war that was just Islamic Jihad versus the Israeli military. And he spoke consistently through that and all throughout the war. If we look at this next slide, this is his last speech, where he, on January 21st, after the ceasefire went into effect, gave a speech that is very typical of the kind of speech he gave. I'll read it to you in full. The enemy's The enemy's barbaric war against our people is not a reaction to a military operation, but rather reflects a premeditated intent of war and genocide against civilians deprived of their basic necessities of life. We began our battle by relying on God, leaving behind our homes, our families, and everything we owned. We understood the difficulty and responsibility placed upon us as the resistance by our people, knowing that we are confronting the occupation alongside a group of believers in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran on behalf of 1.5 billion Muslims. Our religious and national duty requires us to confront the occupation by all means with absolute trust in God to guide and support us. From the beginning of this battle, our slogan has been, no matter how long the war lasts, we are its soldiers. We have prepared for it. We have prepared for it a generation of strong moral and educational foundations, and behind us stand our heroic people whose steadfastness alongside us is unparalleled in history, and we owe to them immense obligations. We salute the steadfastness of the people in Lebanon. He shouts out Hassan Nasrallah and the martyred brothers in the fight in Lebanon. He talks about Yemen and salutes Abdul Malik al-Houthi for their position with their missiles and drones. He thanks the Iraqi resistance and the Iranians for Operation True Promise 1 and 2. And he did this throughout the war, talking about the unity of fields, talking about the multiple fronts in the war. And of course, his powerful voice was alongside some significant resistance videos. I'm going to show you one here where he says, "You little mercenaries without conscience or justice, we will destroy your ambitions on the land of Gaza, just as we destroyed your ancestors' ambitions on the walls of Acre. God is our witness." Let's take a look at that one. Let's take a listen to it. It's number 3.
أيها الأقزام المرتزقة يا عديمي الضمير والإنصاف سنحطم آمالكم على أرض غزة كما حطمنا آمال أسلافكم على أسوار عكا والله على ما نقول شهيد.
Again, so he's addressing the Israelis and he says, "You little mercenaries without conscience or justice, we will destroy your ambitions on the land of Gaza." Your designs on Gaza. And this operation was a remarkable operation. People may remember we broke it down at length on the show back in late January, early February. This is the use of an unexploded Israeli-American bomb that their engineering units rewired and detonated against an Israeli military position there. That decoy that you saw, the RPG fire, was the decoy, and then the building was detonated. So that was the first of the return to sender operations that became famous throughout the war. And it's obvious what you're watching on your screens. If you're listening at home, you're seeing a devastating military operation reusing unexploded ordnance, which is something that buoyed the resistance throughout this battle. And Abu Hamza's words were strong and fitting for that operation. We look at the next one. We have another one here. Before that came on the eve of the battle in Rafah, at the end of the battle in Khan Yunis, where he addresses, we might be just pulling that up. Let me tell you one thing in the meantime. In March 2024, he said, this is something that he put throughout all of his speeches. He says, "We say to our people that the resistance shares with you all the circumstances you are experiencing, and we will later reveal scenes of this battle and the defense of our fighters in the alleys of terror and the fields of martyrdom. We say to our people that you are the symbol of dignity, pride, and the crowns on our heads. We will not relinquish your rights, no matter how much we share the pain and wounds with you. We will be able to continue this battle no matter how long it lasts." So that next video from Rafah, if we could pull that one up here.
إن حضورنا الميداني وعلى مشارف الشهر السابع للمعركة يحمل رسالة هامة، وهي أننا نرفض الاحتلال ولن نسمح له بالاستقرار على أرض غزة، وعلى العدو الذي يفكر بالبقاء واجتياح رفح أن يلتقط الإشارة جيدا.
So as the international media and local media was braying for the invasion of Rafah, this is the ending battles in Khan Yunis, which was the battle before Rafah. And they ended this battle by putting out this video of a remarkable operation, multi-pronged complex operation, RPG fire at an Israeli position in behind that rock, in behind the tank that you see there, and then the IED that was set up and then detonated versus the tank. So it hits the position, and then you're going to see here it hit the tank and explode. And this was a strong message to the Israelis who were about to invade Rafah. And he says in that audio you heard, he said, "Our presence on the battlefield on the cusp of the 7th month carries an important message, more eloquent than rockets and missiles." That was in the original speech. More eloquent than rockets and missiles was not in that video, but it's in the original speech. And he goes on to say, "It states that we reject occupation and we will not allow it to establish itself on the land of Gaza, and the enemy considers the idea, and if the enemy considers the idea of staying and invading Rafah, he must heed this message well." So that was the kind of way that he was used throughout this war at critical moments, coming out, unifying his people, speaking for all factions, speaking for all Palestinians, and speaking with a revolutionary armed struggle primacy in what he was saying, always putting the people first, saying that they're in the same trench. Let's look at number 4 tomorrow. Number 4B, you can see that the unity of fields is it goes across both international, where he talks about Yemen, and he talks about the Iraqi resistance, and he talks about Lebanon. But coming up here, we're going to show you that the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, there it is. Perfect. Thank you. Excellent, Tamara. So the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, the leftist PFLP, they came out and issued a martyr poster for him for the Joint Operations Room and the solidarity across factions. You have the leftists and the Islamists communicating here. They said, "The martyr leader Abu Hamza left his mark in the field of military media resistance, and his presence instilled fear and terror in the crumbling occupation entity. He was a model of the resistance fighter. He was uncompromising, always on the front lines of confrontation. Despite the immense pain of losing Abu Hamza, who never submitted, we confirm that his loss will only increase our determination and steadfastness to continue on the path of martyrs in the struggle and fight until every last drop of blood to fulfill and complete our liberation and the expulsion of the occupation from all of our Palestinian land and the restoration of our people's stolen rights and the recovery of our lands and the avenging of the blood of our martyrs." So he's speaking to all factions. All factions saluted him, and you can see there in that photo from the Abu Ali Mustafa Brigade's poster just how young Abu Hamza was, and to be speaking for so many years and so effectively at that young age. This is significant loss to the resistance movements in Gaza, and part of that series of assassinations in Gaza this week. We are going to move, as I said, now to Yemen. And again, this is the Resistance Report for day 531. I'm Jon Elmer, and you're listening to the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm reporting this on March the 20th. These are fast-moving stories, but Ansar Allah in Yemen, who were observing the ceasefire when it went into place on January 19th. More or less immediately, they released the crew of the Israeli ship that they had commandeered. They adhered to the ceasefire terms of the ceasefire, and they had stopped their attacks in the Red Sea when Israel on March the 2nd resumed the blockade on Gaza. Ansar Allah gave a period of time, then gave a warning, and then said they were going to resume blocking ships servicing Israeli ports and Israeli ships transiting through the Red Sea. Only Israeli ships. The U.S. responded by opening a war on Yemen last week. On this past weekend, since you last saw us on our last show, the war was opened. If you want to hear some more background on the blockade, I did a whole segment on it on last week's show. And like I said, events are moving quickly. So we now have one show later, we're reporting on the U.S. bombing now 5 straight days onshore in Yemen in response to a threat. It's a response to a threat because according to maritime organizations and trackers, there has not been any attacks on Israeli shipping, but the Americans used this as an opportunity to attack Yemen. And then the Israelis used that as an opportunity to attack Gaza and scrap the ceasefire and destroy it. So the U.S. responded by carrying out attacks onshore, more than 47 bombing raids inside Yemen, again, killing civilians in an attempt to, the United States said, quote, restore freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, something that already existed if there was a ceasefire, which they, the United States, are the guarantors of. So, a weak position by the Americans, by the Trump administration that has been flouting that they want to be peacemakers. They have blown up the ceasefire, and the main target now is civilians again. And this is a proven failed strategy against Yemen. Yemen has endured 25,000 airstrikes from the Saudi-U.S. coalition that attacked, blockaded, and destroyed their country from 2015 to 2022. And the Ansar Allah movement points to that all the time. They say, we are a blockaded people. We know what a blockade means. And that's why we are blockading Gaza, blockading Israel in solidarity with Gaza, because we know what it's like to be Gaza. And as Craig Mokhiber said early on, they're fulfilling a legal obligation to intervene in a genocide. And that's what they're doing. So after the U.S. strikes on Yemen, Abdel Malik al-Houthi said on Sunday that the aircraft carrier American warships will become the targets. So they are escalating step by step. The Yemenis said that more than 50 people were killed, including many women and children, as is always the case. And that is the case in this situation. Now, if we pull up the map, we can take a look at that tomorrow. We can see just what we're talking about. The blockade is, of course, the Bab el-Mandab, which is what Craig was talking about, is at the bottom of that map, the pincer, the choke point there of the Red Sea coming in off the Gulf of Aden. And then you follow the Red Sea up along Saudi Arabia there and to the Suez Canal, where shipping is down more than half, or you hang a right in the Red Sea into Eilat, where there's an Israeli port that has been all but shut down, bankrupt, with no incoming car vessels. It's mainly a car shipping port, has been shut down, and there are American warships in that area so-called defending freedom of navigation. If we look at the next slide, you'll see this is the promo that Ansar Allah and the Yemeni armed forces released this week. On screen, it says the decision is being implemented, and in the background, it has Yahya Sari, who's the brigadier general and the spokesperson. You see him there, spokesperson for the Yemeni armed forces, saying the Yemeni armed forces affirm the following: we are resuming the ban on all Israeli ships passing through the Yemeni area of operations, which I just showed you on that map. Abdel Malik al-Houthi said the decision has entered into force. Any ship passing through the declared area of operations will be targeted. This is a practical step and a necessary stance in response to the aggressive escalation by the Israeli enemy against the Palestinian people in Gaza. We assure that this is not the ceiling of our position, but rather the first step, al-Houthi said. Therefore, we will also go in the direction of further escalatory steps, which they have done because the United States began the bombing raids, Israel began its massacres in Gaza, and so the Yemeni armed forces responded with 18 winged missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles, and drones in a joint operation that was carried out by the missile force and the Navy. The naval forces, and they said that engagement lasted for many hours. and that the American aircraft carrier, the USS Harry Truman, after clashing with our armed forces, fled far north of the Red Sea, a distance 1,300 kilometers away. The Israeli enemy's insistence on preventing the entry of aid to the Gaza Strip is a major aggression and a terrible and horrific crime that cannot be tolerated. Banning Israeli ships from navigation is the first step, but when the Palestinian people's famine in Gaza intensifies, we cannot stand idly by. And indeed, they did, launching ballistic missiles, which I will get to shortly. If we take a look at number 7, you can see the way that they communicate. They communicate. Brigadier General Yahya Sari here. He gives a speech. Anytime there's an action, he comes up, he announces a speech, and he delivers the speech with the details of the action, the reason it was taken, and it's tight speeches that give you all the details. So you see this was the first attack, and he says, in response to this aggression, the armed forces carried out a specific military operation targeting the American aircraft carrier USS Harry S. Truman and its warships hit the warships in the flotilla that protect the aircraft carrier in the northern Red Sea with 18 ballistic and cruise missiles and a drone. This operation was jointly carried out by the naval forces. So each time these operations happen, he puts out a statement like this detailing the operation. And these are generally confirmed by the American military, if not right after, generally at some point in the engagement they are. And the U.S. is defending against these missiles and drones that cost about the size of a family car, with anti-aircraft missiles that are interceptor missiles, standard missiles, cruise, ship-launched, shipborne guided missiles that range in price from $1.5 million to upwards of $20 million in this massively asymmetric battle. If we look at number 7B, the flotilla was spotted on satellite today for the first time. They had their transponders off previously, and what you're seeing is the carrier strike group that includes the USS Truman, USS Stout, USS Dunham, USS Sullivans, and the USS Gettysburg. The Gettysburg is the one I reported on last week in my report that shot down its own plane, taking off from the aircraft carrier. There's also spotting of a nuclear sub that is part of that flotilla that has now been targeted 5 times, one each day since the American operation began. And just to give you a sense, in Task and Purpose is a military publication that had an interview with a retired naval commander who talked about over the 15-month period from October 19th, 2023 to January 19th, when there was a ceasefire, the Navy saw the most intense combat at sea since World War II. It is kind of amazing, he said, the commander said, it's kind of amazing how the Navy has held up with no losses, but the cost has been pretty enormous. You can see those ships there off the coast of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And he began right away. He describes on October 19th, 2023, the destroyer, the USS Kearney, which was with the Eisenhower aircraft carrier, spent 10 hours shooting down 15 Houthi drones, and 4 cruise missiles in the most intense combat engagement by a U.S. military warship since World War II. So that was the first day of the war in the Battle of the Red Sea. It was the most since World War II, and that was for 15 drones. And on Monday, the Ansar Allah and Yemeni armed forces fired 18 drones over several hours. So that gives you a sense from the naval point of view what it's like to be part of those attacks. The Kearney would go on to face 51 other engagements. And if we look at the next slide, you can see where the ships are on satellite imagery. This is satellite imagery from Sentinel and compiled by Naval Tracker MT Anderson. And the War Zone pointed out that in January, during the ceasefire, that the U.S. Navy revealed that it had fired 400 munitions since October 2023 as part of their operations in the Red Sea, including 120 Standard 2 SM-2 missiles that are 2.5 $3.5 million apiece, 80 SM-6s that are $4.5 million, and a combined total of 20 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and SM-3s, which can top out at upwards of $30 million pop. And we're talking per unit cost, not deployment costs. So they're spending tens of billions of dollars to protect the genocide that they underwrote the ceasefire to as guarantors. So remarkable developments by the Americans. They're clearly escalating this battle. If we look at the next slide, Trump said that the Ansar Allah movement was not popular. One day after the bombing missions by the Americans, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of Ansar Allah, told his people to come out for a demonstration the next day. Look at the size of this demonstration that was called one day before. And people who have been following this conflict know that these demonstrations take place every Friday. That looks like they're called the Million Man Marches. They sure look like a million. They're definitely many hundreds of thousands. And this position that Ansar Allah is taking is very popular locally. The support for Palestine is very popular. Look at the size of that demonstration. And they have been doing these over and over and over again. So they're not going to they're not going to surrender like Trump said. Trump said that the war will go on until Ansar Allah surrenders, and they're not going to. And if we look at after this one, the next one, you can see the weapons promo that they put out after that, which talks, the Pentagon talked this week about how there had been 170 separate attacks by Ansar Allah and the Yemeni armed forces against U.S. Navy shipping or U.S. Navy warships since 2023. And you can see there the Palestine 2 ballistic missile being launched there. You see the drones that they launch. That's the Jaffa drone that hit Tel Aviv. They just showed that. Those are the 2 tankers. They've only sunk 2 tankers. They give warnings and threats and tell people to turn around. They fire warning shots. 4 sailors have died, 3 on a ship, and 1 Navy SEAL fell into the water on the deployment. Doesn't really count to me as a casualty of this operation. And if we look at the next slide, you can see that Ansar Allah promised to escalate, and Israel escalated, and this is what Ansar Allah got. They got Palestine 2 ballistic missiles fired at Israel. This is at the Nevatim Air Base in southern Israel. And if we look at the next slide, this was today, just now, as Abu Ubaidah was talking about, how their missiles in the sky overlapped with Qassam's rockets from Gaza. The Yemeni armed forces today said, in support of the oppressed Palestinian people and in response to the massacres committed by the criminal Zionist enemy against our brothers and sisters in the Gaza Strip, the missile force of the Yemeni armed forces carried out a qualitative military operation targeting Ben Gurion Airport. As you can see, that's the Israeli military. If you're listening at home, we're showing a red alert sirens from the Israeli Defense Forces that are all over central Israel and the heartland. More than 2 million people fled to the shelters. The Yemeni armed forces said that they were attacked with a Jaffa drone, or sorry, they attacked Jaffa with a Palestine 2 ballistic missile that you saw being launched there. And this is the 5th consecutive day of these attacks. In response, the armed forces, in response to what the Israelis have carried out in Gaza that we've been reporting on this show, the Knesset emptied from those missile launches, ran for shelters, and the Israeli Red Crescent, or the Magen David Odom, reported 13 trip and falls and several other anxiety incidents from that ballistic missile fire that the Israelis say was intercepted. We saw pieces of shrapnel in interior of Israel. So that is the Yemeni front, and reporting on Gaza for the resistance report for this week. It seems that we are going to be back with this reporting now that the war seems to be on again from all that we have seen.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah, it's hard to know where this is going to go. we have a bunch of discussion items to get to, but maybe just kind of an open question is what happens to the ceasefire talks now? What is the status? They were we're a month late for the phase 2 negotiations, and that was assuming that phase 1 negotiations would be followed through with and not be broken by Israel. But here we are.
Well, one of the things that is notable is that even though we're returning to this horrific level of barbarity, yesterday the U.S. administration said that there's a proposal on the table, even though that is the disingenuous 𝐓𝐡𝐞 proposal to rewrite the terms of the deal. They say there's a proposal on the table. And Hamas has said that they're still committed to the deal and they're willing to talk, although they're not willing to accept the diktat that was thrown on at them because Netanyahu doesn't want to proceed to phase 2 of the deal, which he signed onto, that the United States brokered and is a guarantor for. So there is still a glimmer of hope that I know that many of our friends and colleagues in Gaza hold on to, that this is
a negotiating strategy.
Yes, a negotiation by massacre, by baby murder. But that's something to hope for rather than just, month after month after month more of massacring 85, 90, 100, 200 people a day. Yeah. So we don't know. It's very hard to tell, Nora, but we do know what the different parties are saying.
Yes, Hamas has been, and they have said even through the massacres that they're ready to negotiate, that they're continuing to negotiate, and the reasons that they rejected the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 proposal were clear. Osama Hamdan said just the other day that 𝐓𝐡𝐞's proposal is limited to prisoner exchanges only. 𝐓𝐡𝐞's proposal does not address a ceasefire, an opening of the crossings, or an ending of the siege. The siege on the Gaza Strip, the starvation, and the closure of the crossings cannot be acceptable to the Palestinian people. This is the whole point. You cannot get Qassam to hand over all the prisoners and to have an occupation and a war that continues. Those have been their principles from day one. So this 𝐓𝐡𝐞 proposal, this bridging proposal, it's just a non-starter for the Palestinians. But the ability to negotiate and desire to negotiate is still there for Hamas. They're still in Doha. They're still in Cairo negotiating in good faith for an agreement that was already agreed to and was guaranteed by the United States and Qatar, whose air bases the United States uses for these operations, and by Egypt, who has a crossing with Gaza that is sealed closed. So there's just a lot of insincerity, to put it politely, from these murderous governments that are now killing people in Gaza. The Israeli government is dropping bombs in the same day in Lebanon, in Syria, in the West Bank, in Gaza. The United States government of peace of Trump's is dropping bombs in Somalia, dropping bombs in Anbar, Iraq, and dropping bombs on the poorest country in the Middle East, in Yemen, on the same days in some cases. So it's a really dark time where murderers are leading governments.
As always. Well, let's talk about if you read Israeli media, there are demonstrations in the streets of Tel Aviv because people are very upset that that these bombings are resuming, leading to putting Israeli captives' lives in danger, those who are still left in Gaza. Ali, what can you say about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out very quickly, if we look at this headline in the Washington Post, that they have, as Israel resumes war in Gaza, families of hostages fear the worst. And we have this quote from Noah Argamani, a former captive in Gaza. And you can see there it says that she recalled the terror she endured when the previous ceasefire collapsed in November 2023. And the terror was because of the bombing. And
Right.
just I'll point out that there are lots of statements like this from former captives and from families. And there are also statements, we won't go into them now, from the Israeli military acknowledging that their actions endanger the captives, but saying, oh, we're being very careful. I don't know how you're being very careful when you kill 174 children in a single day. That doesn't sound like careful. So I just wanted to point that out. And then just also to contrast what Americans are being told by their government and much of their media with what the Israeli media is saying, or at least part of it. And we can take a look at this item from Al Jazeera, which is just reporting on what the the U.S. ambassador at the United Nations said today. She said, this is Dorothy Shea, the U.S. ambassador, saying that Hamas, quote, bears the sole responsibility for the war and the resumption of hostilities in Gaza after a failure to respond to President Donald Trump's warnings. But then if you look at this headline from Haaretz, this is from the main editorial of Haaretz, which is, sort of liberal in Israeli terms. And you see the headline there, Israel, not Hamas, is derailing the Gaza ceasefire and preventing the hostage return. And in this editorial, they quote Eli Cohen, who was freed from Gaza, who called the renewed warfare, quote, a death sentence for the hostages. So again, that's another Israeli former captive saying that the biggest danger to the captives in Gaza is Israel. But then the Haaretz editorial again addresses the claim that Hamas is responsible for this resumption of the full-scale massacres. Haaretz says, quote, but it must be said loudly and clearly that this is a lie. It was Israel, not Hamas, that violated the agreement. And then they say, Netanyahu abandoned the hostages to save his government. The outcry from the hostages' families and hostages who have returned interests neither him nor the members of his governing coalition. For them, the main thing is the approval of the state budget. And the reference to the state budget there is because under the Israeli rules, if the Knesset, the parliament, cannot pass the budget within a certain amount of time, then the Knesset is automatically dissolved and the government falls, which means Netanyahu loses his position. So that's the importance of passing the budget and getting, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich back into the government, which has now happened. And then another quick headline, also from Haaretz. This is an article by Yossi Melman, who is well known as someone very close to the Israeli intelligence services. He's written books about the intelligence services, and there's a lot of sources there. And there is the headline: there is no justification at all for Israel to resume the war in Gaza. And one quote from that article, Yossi Melman writes, in the current round, it is difficult to find even a shred of justification for the decision to renew the war. From any perspective, this is a war of choice. This is not a war for survival. It is a political war made possible by the blind support of US President Donald Trump for Israel and Netanyahu. So the reason I'm highlighting these articles is that while they're from Haaretz, which is the quote-unquote liberal newspaper, you do find them across the Israeli media, other than the right-wing press that's loyal to Netanyahu, which tells you that the mood in Israel is different from right after October 7th, when there was near unanimity among the Israeli Jewish public about waging a relentless war of murder and revenge against people in Gaza. That consensus is not there now, even if the dissent is not because people care about Palestinians. Very few. There are some Israelis, a small number, who express concern about Palestinians in Gaza, but there is a lot of dissent that comes either out of opposition to Netanyahu or fear for the Israeli captives still held in Gaza. And so that pro-genocide coalition, let's call it, has broken down. And you'll recall, I think it was last week, we talked about maybe 2 weeks ago, but we spoke about the reporting on how broken the Israeli army is. This was mainstream reporting in Israel, how the reserve units are, people aren't showing up, the morale is shot, people don't want to fight, and so on. So there's been more of that just in the last few days. 2 fairly senior reserve officers have been dismissed because they refused. They said they would not go back to war. And one of them, a reserve officer, said, "I will not go back to war for filthy traitors." Those were the words he used, filthy traitors, referring to the government of Israel. So that shows, that's indicative of the level of hatred among Israelis that has only grown during the period of the ceasefire, when they've been freed up a little to turn on each other. And the hatred that many Israelis feel for each other is almost as intense, not quite, but almost as intense as the hatred they feel for Palestinians.
Yeah.
All of this is to say that the domestic front in Israel is not the same as it was after October 7th. And so I think that it may be harder. Again, this is me looking for signs of hope. I plead guilty to that. I'm always looking for signs of hope, but that there are signs that the home front would not necessarily be able to sustain a prolonged and open-ended return to what we experienced in the 16 months up to January 19th. And then you also have to consider the fact, as we've talked about in previous programs with guests like Shir Hever and Ilan Pape, about what does this say to the ordinary Israeli who is not necessarily, who doesn't have any sympathy for the Palestinians, who doesn't really care, but they look at this and they say, what are the prospects for this country? The only thing that my family is being offered is endless war, endless fear, the return of missiles, whether they're coming from Yemen or whether they're coming from Gaza, as we saw today, briefly disrupting operations at Ben Gurion Airport, is something that Israelis thought they'd put behind them. And yet Gaza, the resistance in Gaza, still has the capacity to fire long-range rockets towards the Tel Aviv area, again demonstrating that all the boasts about what the Israeli military achieved during 16 months of unrelenting destruction were basically futile. And so that probably erodes not just public morale, but more and more Israelis will be looking for a way out, simply to say, just have a normal life, because the best that they're offering us here is years of endless war and uncertainty and economic decline and isolation. So those are some of the things I wanted to talk about, including, but I'll just stop there for a second. I'll stop in case anyone has a comment, and then maybe just talk briefly about the international environment as well.
There's also the move by Netanyahu to fire Ronan Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, Israel secret police, just yet another sign of increasing internal contradictions inside so-called Israel. The long, I guess, slow-moving internal collapse of the Israeli domestic military front.
Yeah. I mean, all, and you mentioned this, Ali, the economic decline. I mean, Israel is the budget that, that they have to pass in order to avert total governmental collapse, is a budget of debt. Israel is already talking about, moving to escalate austerity measures. I mean, people, who's gonna, the north of occupied historic Palestine, present day Israel. People aren't going back there. They're not going back to their kibbutzim, in the so-called Gaza envelope. They're still apparently being put up in hotels in Tel Aviv by the government. That is, that's a really expensive venture. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really important to have another guest come back on the live stream soon to kind of sort out this economic quagmire that Israel finds itself in, because it has, prioritized genocide over anything else.
Yeah, exactly. And the Israeli public is largely, again, we're generalizing. Of course, there are some Israelis who oppose, a small number, but who oppose this type of violence against Palestinians on moral grounds, but generally they're
I think we know all 10 of them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a small number. I don't want to say they don't exist, but I just want to put that caveat in there so people don't say, oh, you're painting everyone with the same brush. But we're talking about the broad public, as measured by opinion polls, as measured by all the usual sorts of things, have supported the war, and they will do that, or supported the genocide, as long as it's relatively cost-free to them, as long as they can continue to live a quote-unquote normal life as people are being exterminated and starved to death in a massive death camp just a few miles away. As long as they can pretend it's not there, they've shown that that's largely fine with them. But what we're seeing now is that the social costs on Israel, a lot of them still hidden and not fully accounted for, are mounting. And a major one that we have talked about is the cost of reserve duty, in terms of the disruption to people's work life and family life for very prolonged periods, and the fact that so many reservists are refusing to show up for duty. But the economic costs now, as you pointed out, Nora, the budget that's being debated is directly, they're cutting spending on social services, they're raising taxes, they're raising what's called national insurance contributions, which is like the Social Security and Medicare taxes people in the US pay, or national insurance in the UK. That's all going up for less services. So the Israeli public is now seeing the war come home in economic terms, but then on top of that, now they're running for the shelters again. So in a setting where people perceive this correctly, even many people on the right in Israel perceive this correctly as being about Netanyahu's own personal political interests, it may be hard to sustain. It may be hard to sustain.
Yeah, it will definitely be hard to sustain. Like, these are all material realities, I mean, it's when we look at what's happening to Palestinians, especially this week and the last few weeks, when the full starvation resumed, and then the resumption of the full-on genocide, as we've covered in this stream, it's thoroughly depressing, and it is a depressing reality. But these are also material realities as well. This is the fact that it's, there's talk of civil war in Israeli society. I mean, I think that is probably an exaggeration, but, the fact that this phrase is even being used within Israeli society is a sign of something. It's a sign that there are extreme tensions and contradictions within the Israeli society. And, we always refuse the analysis that says that everything is Netanyahu's fault. But there does seem to be a dynamic in which this particular Israeli prime minister is becoming something of a pariah figure for lots of Israelis, and is even coming to clash with the head of his own security institutions, so-called security institutions, like the secret police, the Shin Bet, and it can't be sustained by the Israelis infinitely. They're not all powerful.
Yeah. And in terms of Israel's enablers and co-conspirators in ongoing genocide and settler colonialism, let's talk about the international response to Israel's resumption of full-scale, full-on genocide. Ali, what can you tell us about states like France, the EU? Give us a sense of what that's been like.
Yeah, as we talked about with Craig Mokhiber earlier in the program, the international response has not been enough. But there is a shift in mood in that we're not seeing from Israel's traditional allies and enablers the same enthusiasm. And there has been fairly strong condemnation from Ireland, which is not that surprising, although my observation on that is it has to go beyond words. And from Spain, again, these are countries that, and Belgium, Spain, Ireland, and Belgium would be the countries within the EU, and Malta as well, that have been the most outspoken, but they were already the most outspoken. What's interesting to me is seeing these reactions. For example, let's take a look at the reaction from the EU, from the High Representative for Foreign Policy, who's, you could basically think of her, 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐿, as the EU foreign minister. And she's a very pro-Israel politician, even more so than her predecessor in this role. And they say, the EU says, it deplores the breakdown of the ceasefire in Gaza and the deaths of civilians, including children, in Israeli airstrikes. Israel must end its military operations and resume entry of humanitarian aid and electricity to Gaza. This is relatively strong language for the EU, which has always been much more both sidesy, if not outright blaming, as they did just within the last few weeks, blaming Hamas directly for the lack of progress in the negotiations. So that's quite striking, the change of tone from the EU, not the change of complicity. I'm not, I'm talking about at the level of rhetoric, what they're signaling, not in terms of their actions, which we still need to see a lot more on. And then let's take a look at the position of France, which came out among the first. And remember earlier when we were talking to Craig Mokhiber, how I pointed out how Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, never uses the word condemns when he's talking about what Israel does. Well, here is the government of France, of Emmanuel Macron, saying, quote, France condemns the Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip that began yesterday, resulting in a large number of civilian casualties. That, again, is much stronger language from France. And let's take a look at this story. Cast your minds back to October 2023. And you can see this story from France 24, but it was a big story at the time, all over the media, where Emmanuel Macron, the French president, called for the anti-ISIS coalition. This is the US-led group of Western countries that bomb Syria and Iraq, supposedly to fight ISIS, although they don't really do that, to basically to fight Hamas. That, he was raising the possibility of basically French and British and American warplanes bombing Gaza on behalf of Israel back in October 2023. And that's certainly not part of the French appetite now. So I just wanted to point to that shift in tone. Of course, the Trump administration Trump himself came out and said just in the last few hours that he fully supports Israel's actions in Gaza, its bombing of Gaza, and blaming Hamas. But who can be surprised by that? And I think it's almost refreshing that the U.S. position is, of course, horrific beyond words, but it's at least honest. It's at least honest. We don't have Joe Biden and Antony Blinken giving their full support and providing the bombs to these massacres as they did for 16 months, and hand-wringing about the Palestinians they're helping Israel murder. So at least we get sort of truth in advertising from the Americans now.
I mean, and I think personifying that a good example of just that is Chuck Schumer peddling his depraved new book, supposedly on anti-Semitism. I mean, what can we? Why did you want to bring up Chuck Schumer at this point? And
well, he is still Chuck Schumer is still the most senior elected Democrat in the country. He's the head of the Democrats in the Senate, which makes him the most senior elected Democrat currently. And I think we spoke last week, Nora, or we've spoken about it many times, about sort of the disgusting gloating from some quarters saying, oh, well, if you just voted for Kamala Harris and the Democrats, things would be different. Well, they weren't different. What we're going back to now is Joe Bidenism. It's Donald Trump adopting the policy of Joe Biden of trying to massacre Palestinians into submission. But here comes Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer, to disabuse anyone who has illusions that the Democrats would be any better of those illusions. And he has a new book out, which is called Anti-Semitism in America. And the
subtitle is A Warning or something like that.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into some of what he's warning about in a second.
Ridiculous.
But he has been doing the rounds of the TV studios to promote his book. And he was on The View on ABC on Tuesday. And let's take a look at the clip of that.
Really never that bad until 2017. And until October 7th last year. Yeah. And all of a sudden,
when the Jews were attacked
by Hamas initially, and the women raped, and the little babies' heads chopped off, and all of that brutally. And all of a sudden, anti-Semitism developed.
What?
Can we play it again?
No.
It was really never that bad until 2017. And until October 7th last year. Yeah. And all of a sudden,
when the Jews were attacked
by Hamas initially, and the women raped, and the little babies' heads chopped off, and all of that brutally.
My God.
And all of a sudden, anti-Semitism developed.
So here we are in March of 2025, and Chuck Schumer is still spreading the atrocity propaganda and lies of beheaded babies. There were no beheaded babies on October 7th. Only one baby, Israeli baby, was killed on October 7th. And that's one too many. I don't care whether a child is Israeli or Palestinian or any other nationality. The death of a child is always horrific and always something to deplore. That baby, Mila Cohen, died from a bullet that was fired through a door. It was a stray bullet. Still a horrible, horrible tragedy. But there were no beheaded babies. And Chuck Schumer is still spreading this atrocity propaganda on the day that Israel killed 174 children at least in Gaza. and there were no rapes. To this day, there are still not a single credible claim of a rape on October 7th, not a single identified victim. And this is effectively the leader of the Democratic Party spreading this atrocity propaganda. I actually took a look at his book because I wanted to see what was in the book that he's hawking around TV studios. And you can see from, I tweeted some of these excerpts from the book, but in the book he doesn't mention beheaded babies, but he does mention, he does claim one disgusting thing is he claims that the reason that there are so many Palestinians killed in Gaza is that quote, I'm not doing these in the same order as you, Tamara, I'm sorry, it's okay, but here we go. Yeah, this one. No, the previous one, the one you had before. Yeah, so he claims that the reason there are so many civilians being killed is that, he says, the blame falls on Hamas for using the civilian population as human shields. This is how he's justifying genocide.
Deplorable.
Deplorable. And if we go to the next one, you can see that he does repeat the atrocity propaganda about rape, and then uses that to attack pro-Palestinian, well, anti-genocide protesters who he accuses of celebrating rapes and murders. So that's how he tries to delegitimize protest against Joe Biden's, at that time's, policies of supporting this massacre. And again, and then he also, in the previous one, if you go back to the previous one, he also says that he's alarmed by the stridency of the messaging about Israel committing in America, enabling what they consider genocide, and basically accusing people who accurately describe what's going on in Gaza as genocide, accusing them of anti-Semitism. So
I mean, this book, right? Like, who's going to read it, first of all? Who is it marketed towards?
Well, it's marketed to the viewers of The View, and he was on MSNBC with Chris Hayes marketing this book, who's supposed to be a progressive, Chris Hayes, and he's giving a platform to this kind of atrocity propaganda and this pandering to this lie that anti-Semitism is rife in America. It isn't. There's a lot of, that's not to say it's non-existent, but just like in Europe, the real anti-Semitism, the dangerous anti-Semitism that should really frighten us is on the right, is in the government, is coming from the right-wing parties that are on the march in Europe. It's not coming from the people going to the streets to oppose the horrific genocide that's being backed by these governments. It's coming from Elon Musk, who's giving literal Nazi salutes at rallies. So that's just to put in perspective how this charge of anti-Semitism is weaponized against people protesting genocide. It's weaponized against Mahmoud Khalil and against all the other people who are being rounded up and imprisoned or deported. And the Democratic Party, including its top leaders, are utterly explicit. And I posted, I didn't prepare this, Tamara, I'm sorry, but there was a statement that Kamala Harris gave in July of 2024 after protests against the genocide. If I put that statement up without telling you who made it, you wouldn't be able to tell if that was Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. So vitriolic is she, so condemnatory of people protesting against genocide and calling them pro-Hamas. Language that's indistinguishable from the language that the administration is using right now to jail and deport people. So it's important to keep that stuff in mind. Thank you, Tamara. You're always incredible at finding that. Look at this here. She says, and this was July 25th, 2024, and she says, I support the right to peacefully protest, but let's be clear, anti-Semitism, hate, and violence of any kind have no place in our nation. What anti-Semitic acts does she even name in this? She claims, I condemn the individuals associating with the brutal terrorist organization Hamas, which has vowed to annihilate the state of Israel and kill Jews. Pro-Hamas graffiti and rhetoric is abhorrent, and we must not tolerate it in our nation. So this sort of blanket statement, where, you know, you could find, I mean, perhaps in a country of 350 million people, you could find people going to protest, perhaps they're provocateurs. You could find one or two people saying outrageous things, saying things that are wrong, and you will find immediately that the people in the movement, the other protesters, will be the first to call them out and to say, no, that's not what we stand for. But you never saw Kamala Harris or Chuck Schumer saying, we stand with the vast majority of these protesters who are against genocide. They never did that. They only ever focused on the extreme outliers they could find to smear the whole movement, or they smeared the whole movement. And the reason for that is because they can't stand against the genocide because they're the ones who did the genocide.
Yeah. I want to make the point quickly that what we've said it before, I'm sure we'll say it again, what Chuck Schumer said in his book and on The View about Palestinians supposedly raping Israelis on October the 7th is a complete and utter lie. And as we've documented extensively at the Electronic Intifada on this live stream and in articles, not only is there no evidence that any rapes of Israelis took place on October the 7th, there's no evidence, but there's also no allegations. There are no concrete allegations of specific named or anonymous victims of Palestinians raping Israelis taking place on October the 7th. It didn't happen. It's a complete lie. It's a complete fabrication.
And there is a new UN report detailing Israeli sexual violence against Palestinians that, because of everything that's been happening, I haven't had a chance to read it fully yet. I don't want to really comment on it before I've had a chance to read it fully, but that's something that's on our radar, and I want to come back to once I've had a chance to carefully read it.
And of course, Chuck Schumer won't give that report the time of day.
Well, he has his own facts.
It's right.
He doesn't need actual facts. He can make up his own.
No. But here at the Electronic Intifada, we are factual, fact-based, as always. Let's take a look at the website and kind of tour around the features that we've published just in the last 48 hours, and news and analysis by our staff editors. We also published Mahmoud Khalil's statement that he wrote from a Louisiana ICE detention center. It's a really powerful statement, and we're proud to publish that. Right there at the top, how a doctor treated Palestinian victims of Israeli torture. That is an interview that I did recently, just before Israel resumed its mass-scale bombings, with a Canadian doctor who was working in Gaza, in Khan Yunis at a hospital, and she was there when the ceasefire in January, when the ceasefire was called, and she was able to work shoulder to shoulder with physicians in Khan Yunis, treating Palestinians who had just been released from Israeli torture camps. So she details what she saw and some of the stories that are just incredibly harrowing, but really important to document. We have just an incredible amount of stories as usual. So please go to electronicintifada.net to read and share and like and subscribe. sign up for our email list. You can get notified of everything that we publish. We only email you once a day. And if you have a few bucks, go to the Donate Now link right there at the top right and continue to support this vital, vital work. Anything else you want to say, Ali, before we head out?
Just to thank everyone. So many people who've been writing to us who feel heartbroken and in despair with what's happening now with the resumption of these massacres, who feel a sense of community being here with us and with each other. And we feel that love from you, and it means the world to us. It's what has kept us going, all of us, not just Nora, Asa, John, myself, Tamara, Eli Gerzon, who's also behind the scenes with us today, but everyone, the whole team at the Electronic Intifada. Your love and support has really kept us going, and we will be here. We will be here for the people in Gaza, for the people in Palestine, and for each other for as long as we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamara Nassar, for directing and producing this live stream and all the podcasts as per usual. Maureen Claire Murphy, our senior editor, Michael F. Brown, our associate editor, Eli Gerzon for social media. I also want to give a special shout out to Pierre Loisel, who's an old friend of mine and John's, who is producing the hour-long Electronic Intifada radio show that he puts together after these live streams. And we're racking up different radio stations across the US and Canada who are eager to take this content. So thank you, Pierre, for making that happen. And everyone at the Electronic Intifada, on behalf of myself, John, Ali, Asa, and Tamara, thank you, and we'll see you next week.
From